Every morning, you wake with the vivid sensation that you were just somewhere else entirely, experiencing a narrative so real and immediate that it feels like lived experience. Yet within moments, the details begin to slip away like water through your fingers, and by the time you have finished your first cup of coffee, almost nothing remains except perhaps a vague emotional residue or a single fragmented image that dissolves when you try to focus on it directly. This common phenomenon appears to stem from the fundamental mechanics of how your brain processes and stores information during sleep, particularly during the rapid eye movement phase when most vivid dreaming occurs. During waking hours, your brain continuously consolidates new information by converting short-term sensory experiences into stable long-term memories through the strengthening of neural connections, a process that relies heavily on the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, which is released by your locus coeruleus and helps tag experiences as important enough to remember. However, during REM sleep, when dreams are most intense and emotionally engaging, the levels of norepinephrine in your brain plummet dramatically, essentially removing the chemical marker that would normally signal to your neural networks that these experiences should be preserved and stored for later retrieval. Your brain during this state is simultaneously generating elaborate narratives and sensory experiences while simultaneously failing to encode them into your permanent memory, creating a strange paradox where your consciousness experiences something vividly in the moment, while your biological machinery deliberately refuses to commit these experiences to lasting storage. As we drift toward sleep each night, our brains undergo a profound chemical transformation that fundamentally alters how neurons communicate with one another. And this neurochemical shift may be precisely what erases our dream memories from conscious awareness before we even fully awaken. During waking hours, our brains maintain elevated levels of norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter that sharpens focus, enhances memory formation, and keeps our minds alert to external stimuli and internal thoughts. But as sleep approaches and deepens, the production of this crucial chemical begins to decline dramatically, cascading through neural pathways and dimming the very mechanisms responsible for converting fleeting dream experiences into lasting memories. The theory suggests that without sufficient norepinephrine in our brains during and immediately after dreaming, the hippocampus, which serves as our brain's initial filing system for new information, simply cannot adequately process and consolidate the bizarre narratives and disconnected imagery of our dreams into the kind of stable memories we can reliably recall upon waking. Simultaneously, other neurotransmitters like serotonin shift their production patterns, creating a neurochemical environment so fundamentally different from our waking state that the dream content becomes neurologically orphaned, unable to bridge the gap between the sleeping brain's chemical milieu and the waking brain's altogether different neurochemical configuration. This explanation possesses an elegant logic that resonates with neuroscience, yet we find it remarkable that despite our increasingly sophisticated understanding of these chemical processes, we continue to accept dream amnesia as an inevitable and unremarkable feature of human sleep, rather than viewing it as a curious quirk worthy of intervention or deeper investigation. As though the sheer complexity of our neurochemistry somehow absolves us of the responsibility to question why nature would design such an efficient system for forgetting rather than remembering the creative productions of our sleeping minds. Within the brain's intricate chemical landscape exists a neurotransmitter called noradrenaline, sometimes referred to as norepinephrine, which plays a fundamental role in maintaining alertness, focus, and the consolidation of memories during waking hours. During the day, this molecule surges through neural pathways, helping us attend to important stimuli, process novel information, and maintain the vigilance necessary for survival and productivity. However, as evening approaches and our bodies prepare for sleep, noradrenaline levels naturally decline, creating a neurochemical environment that is fundamentally incompatible with the intense brain activity required to encode and retain memories. The mechanism here is surprisingly straightforward. Noradrenaline is essential for the kind of active, conscious attention that would normally allow us to notice and remember our dreams as they occur. When noradrenaline levels plummet during sleep, particularly during the rapid eye movement phases when most vivid dreaming takes place, the brain lacks the neurochemical resources necessary to simultaneously experience a dream and mark it as important enough to transfer into longer-term memory storage. It is as though the brain's filing system has been temporarily shut down, leaving dreams to evaporate like morning mist without ever being properly cataloged. This explains why dreams feel so slippery and ephemeral the moment we wake. The very chemical that would have allowed us to cement the experience into memory was absent during its occurrence. What makes this phenomenon particularly curious is how thoroughly normalized it has become in human experience. We accept without question that dreams are by nature forgettable, treating this as an inevitable feature of sleep, rather than recognizing it as a direct consequence of our neurochemistry. Yet this assumption persists despite the fact that we possess full consciousness and awareness during dreams themselves, leading to the peculiar paradox where we experience entire narratives, emotions, and scenarios with seeming clarity, only to find them utterly inaccessible to recall within moments of waking. Consider the moment you wake from sleep, when fragments of narrative dissolve like watercolor paintings left in the rain, when you grasp desperately at the edges of scenes and dialogues that were moments ago vivid and consuming, yet slip away with each conscious breath you draw. This phenomenon finds its explanation in the remarkable biology of the hippocampus, a seahorse-shaped structure nestled deep within the medial temporal lobe of the brain that serves as the primary architect of memory formation and consolidation. During the rapid eye movement stage of sleep, when most dreaming occurs, the hippocampus becomes functionally disconnected from the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for rational thought, narrative construction, and the encoding of memories into long-term storage. This neurochemical isolation happens because the brain during REM sleep dramatically reduces its production of norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter essential for attention and memory transfer, creating a state where the hippocampus can generate extraordinarily vivid and complex experiences while simultaneously being cut off from the mechanisms required to cement them into retrievable memory. The dreams feel real and present in the moment of dreaming because the hippocampus is actively engaged in their creation, yet without the chemical bridge between this memory-generating region and the prefrontal cortex, the information never receives the encoding necessary for waking recall. You wake in the morning with only a residual emotional tone or a fleeting image because your conscious mind, now flooded with norepinephrine once more, cannot access the elaborate narratives your sleeping brain constructed throughout the night. We have come to accept this as inevitable, as though the ephemeral nature of dreams represents some profound truth about consciousness itself, when in fact it simply reflects a temporary biological disconnection that occurs reliably in every human being with predictable regularity. Consider the experience of waking from a vivid dream only to find that within moments of opening your eyes, the narrative dissolves into fragments and eventually vanishes entirely, leaving behind only a vague emotional residue and the certainty that something meaningful had occurred during sleep. This phenomenon becomes particularly pronounced when you attempt to focus your conscious attention on recalling the dream details, which paradoxically seems to accelerate their disappearance rather than cement them into memory. The Salience network theory proposes that our brains operate according to a hierarchy of attentional importance, where only information deemed significant enough to warrant cognitive resources receives the neural activation necessary for encoding into long-term memory. During waking hours, this network prioritizes survival-relevant information, social cues, threats, and tasks aligned with our current goals and immediate environment, essentially filtering reality through a lens of practical relevance. Dreams, by their very nature, lack this contextual salience because they do not present immediate threats, do not require behavioral responses in the external world, and do not connect to our active goals or social hierarchies in any direct way. When you transition from sleep to wakefulness, your brain rapidly redirects its attentional resources toward the pressing concerns of the day ahead, toward the sensory input flooding in from your environment, and toward the social and professional obligations awaiting you. The Salience network essentially deprioritizes dream content in real time, allocating minimal neural resources to consolidating these memories, because doing so would represent an inefficient use of cognitive capacity. This mechanism persists as a fundamental feature of human cognition because it has proven evolutionarily adaptive, ensuring that our limited memory resources remain devoted to information that genuinely impacts survival, reproduction, and social standing. During the rapid eye movement stage of sleep, when our most vivid dreams occur, the brain enters a state of neurochemical complexity that fundamentally alters how it processes and consolidates information. And one particularly compelling theory suggests that the temporary suppression of protein synthesis during certain sleep phases may be directly responsible for the evanescence of our dream memories upon waking. The brain requires proteins to form the molecular structures necessary for long-term memory formation. And when the mechanisms responsible for manufacturing these essential proteins are downregulated or blocked during specific stages of the sleep cycle, the neural pathways that would otherwise encode dream experiences into lasting memories remain incomplete and unstable. This occurs because dreams exist primarily as electrical and chemical patterns firing through the brain without the supporting protein scaffolding that would anchor them into the hippocampus and cortex, the regions most crucial for memory storage and retrieval. When we wake, the absence of these consolidated protein structures means the dream experiences have no biological foundation upon which to rest, so they dissolve like morning mist before consciousness fully solidifies. The paradox that makes this theory particularly persistent in sleep science is that this protein synthesis blockage may actually serve a protective function, preventing the brain from consolidating every fleeting neurological firing into permanent memory, yet we experience this protection as loss. We have become so accustomed to the inevitable disappearance of dreams that we rarely question whether this represents a feature or a flaw of human neurobiology, accepting without examination that dreams should vanish while simultaneously mourning their departure, as though forgetting were simply the natural tax we pay for the restorative benefits of sleep itself. Consider the experience of waking in the morning with a vivid dream still fresh in your mind, only to find that within minutes of sitting up, splashing water on your face, and beginning your daily routine, the dream has vanished almost entirely from conscious recollection, leaving only a faint emotional residue or a single fragmented image behind. This phenomenon relates directly to what neuroscientists and psychologists call state-dependent memory, a well-documented principle suggesting that information encoded in one particular brain state becomes most easily retrievable when you return to that same state, and conversely becomes increasingly difficult to access as you move further away from it. When you're dreaming, your brain exists in a profoundly different neurochemical environment than when you are awake and alert. During REM sleep, when most vivid dreaming occurs, your brain releases different neurotransmitters, suppresses certain regulatory systems, and activates neural networks in patterns that are fundamentally distinct from waking consciousness. The dream itself, with all its bizarre logic and emotional intensity, is encoded within this unique brain state. However, the moment you wake, your neurochemistry shifts dramatically. Your prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thought and memory consolidation, begins to activate more fully. Norepinephrine levels rise, serotonin patterns change, and your brain transitions into an entirely different operating mode. The dream, encoded in the neurochemical language of sleep, becomes increasingly foreign to your waking brain state. It is as though the memory was written in invisible ink that only appears under a specific light. Remove that light, and the message fades from view. This principle explains why dreams slip away so easily, and why the harder you try to grasp them upon waking, the faster they seem to dissolve, because each conscious effort to retrieve them pulls you further into waking awareness and away from the state in which they were formed. During the night, your brain cycles through stages of sleep with remarkable precision, and it is during the rapid eye movement phase, the stage most associated with vivid dreaming and intense neural activity, that something peculiar happens to your memory systems. You drift through elaborate narratives, engage with impossible scenarios, and experience emotions with startling clarity, yet within moments of waking, these experiences evaporate from your conscious mind like morning mist under sunlight, leaving behind only fragmentary traces and an overwhelming sense that something important has slipped away. The mechanism behind this phenomenon lies in the neurochemistry of REM sleep itself, specifically in the dramatic reduction of norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter that plays a crucial role in memory formation and the consolidation of experiences into long-term storage. During waking hours and non-REM sleep stages, norepinephrine levels remain relatively stable, allowing your brain to tag experiences as significant and worthy of remembering. But during REM sleep, this chemical messenger nearly disappears entirely, effectively disabling the biological switch that would normally encode these vivid internal experiences into retrievable memories. Additionally, the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for logical thinking, self-awareness, and critical evaluation, exhibits significantly reduced activity during REM sleep, meaning that even as you dream, your brain lacks the necessary framework to recognize these experiences as unusual or important enough to cement into memory. What remains extraordinary is how thoroughly we have accepted this neurological reality as simply the way things are. How we speak casually about forgotten dreams as though it were inevitable and unremarkable, rather than pausing to consider that we spend roughly 1/4 of our sleeping lives experiencing entire worlds that vanish almost completely from our conscious record. Creating an existence within existence that occurs entirely beyond the reach of our autobiographical memory and sense of continuous identity. Consider the moment just before sleep takes hold, when your mind begins to drift and the conscious world fades into abstraction, yet you find yourself unable to recall the dreams that may have already begun in those liminal spaces between wakefulness and true unconsciousness. This phenomenon can be understood through the lens of prefrontal cortex inactivity, a neurological state that becomes increasingly pronounced as we descend into deeper stages of sleep. The prefrontal cortex, that region of the brain seated behind the forehead and fundamentally responsible for executive functions, logical reasoning, and autobiographical memory encoding, dramatically reduces its metabolic activity during the transition into sleep, and this reduction becomes almost complete during the rapid eye movement stages where most vivid dreaming occurs. When this area of the brain falls quiet, the mechanisms necessary to consolidate fleeting dream narratives into retrievable memories simply do not fire with sufficient intensity, meaning the dream experiences unfold in a consciousness untethered from the very neurological systems that would normally label, organize, and store them for later recall. The brain during sleep essentially lacks the supervisory capacity to say to itself, "I am experiencing this. This is important. Remember this." Without active prefrontal engagement, dreams exist in a kind of eternal present tense, vivid perhaps in the moment of their occurrence, but immediately vulnerable to dissolution the instant you shift toward waking consciousness and the prefrontal regions surge back online. We have somehow accepted this remarkable absence as entirely normal and unremarkable, despite the strangeness of spending a third of our lives in states where our most sophisticated cognitive abilities are essentially offline, rendering entire experiences inaccessible to the very consciousness that inhabits them, as if entire chapters of our inner lives are written in invisible ink that fades before we can read it. Consider the moment when you wake from sleep and immediately find yourself thinking about the email you need to send, the conversation you had yesterday, the meeting scheduled for this afternoon, or the mounting list of responsibilities waiting for you in the hours ahead. This phenomenon, known as interference from waking life, suggests that the concerns, anxieties, and preoccupations of our conscious existence create a kind of psychological static that drowns out the delicate neural signatures of our dreams just as we transition between sleep and wakefulness. When the mind surfaces from the depths of REM sleep, it does not emerge into a quiet space, but rather into an already active landscape populated by emotional concerns and practical worries that have been simmering beneath the surface even while we slept. The moment consciousness returns, the brain's resources immediately redirect themselves toward these pressing matters, and the dream content that was just moments before vivid and engaging begins to fade rapidly as the prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and problem-solving, reasserts its dominance over the more imaginative regions that were active during sleep. This interference works through a kind of priority system in the brain, where evolutionarily relevant concerns about survival, social status, and task completion naturally supersede the retention of fantastical nocturnal narratives that have no immediate practical value. Yet what makes this particularly intriguing is how thoroughly normalized this process has become in modern life, where we wake directly into a storm of notifications, obligations, and time-sensitive demands that ensure our waking preoccupations capture our attention before we even have a chance to reflect on what we have just experienced in sleep. We have constructed lives so densely packed with urgent matters that the dream, already neurologically ephemeral by nature, stands almost no chance of survival against the tsunami of waking concerns that floods the mind the instant our eyes open. Consider the moment you wake from sleep and immediately reach for your phone to check messages, or the instant your alarm sounds and you begin mentally rehearsing the day ahead before your feet even touch the floor. In these crucial seconds following consciousness, your brain shifts into a fundamentally different operational mode, one prioritized entirely toward processing incoming sensory information and constructing new, concrete memories tied to your immediate environment and responsibilities. The dream you were experiencing mere moments before, which existed in a neurological state characterized by loose associations, emotional intensity, and symbolic abstraction, now faces direct competition from this flood of novel stimuli demanding your attention and cognitive resources. This phenomenon, known as overwriting by new memories, suggests that dreams are not merely forgotten through some passive decay, but rather actively displaced by the brain's urgent need to encode and consolidate the present moment into its memory systems. The brain, operating under resource constraints and prioritization hierarchies that have evolved over millions of years, allocates its neural machinery toward information it deems immediately relevant for survival and social function, which rarely includes the surreal narrative of your sleeping mind. A dream about flying through a crystalline city or conversing with your childhood home lacks the adaptive urgency of remembering that you have a meeting in 2 hours or that your colleague mentioned something important yesterday. The moment consciousness arrives and your sensory apparatus floods your awareness with real-world data, the delicate architecture of dream memory, which was never encoded through the same retrieval pathways as waking experiences, finds itself crowded out by this cascade of newer, more contextually relevant information. What makes this process particularly remarkable is how thoroughly normalized it has become, so much so that we rarely acknowledge the active replacement occurring within our minds. Consider the moment just after waking when you sense that something important has dissolved from your consciousness, a narrative or image that felt vivid only seconds before but now exists only as a faint impression, a knowing without content, and despite your immediate efforts to grasp it or reconstruct it through concentration, the memory simply will not cohere back into retrievable form. This experience of dream retrieval failure represents one of the most frustrating yet universal aspects of sleep consciousness, wherein the dreams we experience during REM sleep seem to possess a fundamental instability in how they transfer into long-term memory storage. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon involves the dramatic neurochemical shifts that occur as we transition from sleep to wakefulness, particularly the reduction of norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter crucial for memory consolidation and sustained attention, which plummets to nearly undetectable levels during REM sleep itself and takes time to rebuild as we wake. Without adequate norepinephrine, the brain struggles to encode dream experiences into the hippocampus in ways that create stable, retrievable memories, and by the time we achieve full wakefulness and our neurochemistry rebalances, the neural patterns representing the dream have already begun to fade from the neural substrate. Additionally, dreams lack the contextual anchors and semantic connections that typically strengthen memories in waking life, as they exist in isolation without reinforcement through language, social sharing, or repetition during the dream itself. Despite understanding this mechanism at an intellectual level, we continue to experience profound frustration when dreams slip away, often attempting futile strategies like remaining motionless upon waking or desperately trying to focus on fragmentary details in hopes of recovering the whole experience. Behaviors that suggest we have normalized a losing battle against the architecture of our own neurology, accepting as inevitable what remains, in essence, a systematic failure of our consciousness to retain its own experiences. Dreams unfold within a brain state that operates under fundamentally different neurochemical conditions than waking consciousness, and this difference has profound implications for how deeply experiences are encoded into memory. When you dream, your brain is awash in particular neurotransmitters and lacks others that are typically abundant during the day, most notably norepinephrine, which plays a crucial role in forming lasting memories and maintaining attention to detail. Without sufficient norepinephrine coursing through the neural pathways, the brain fails to tag dream experiences as important information worthy of long-term storage, treating these elaborate narratives with the same indifference it might show toward background noise or peripheral visual information. The hippocampus, that seahorse-shaped structure deep in the brain responsible for converting short-term experiences into long-term memories, receives these dream signals in a weakened context where the typical molecular signals that cement memories into place are largely absent. Furthermore, during REM sleep when most vivid dreaming occurs, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational analysis and the creation of coherent narratives, is significantly less active than during waking hours, which means dreams are not being processed through the same organizational frameworks that make memories sticky and retrievable. This creates a situation where dreams are generated with remarkable vividness and emotional intensity while simultaneously being encoded with a kind of neurological indifference, as though your brain is creating intricate stories while simultaneously deciding they are not worth remembering. We have come to accept this strange contradiction as simply the nature of dreams, rarely questioning why an experience so vivid and emotionally resonant would be so rapidly forgotten, almost as though our brains maintain two separate standards for what constitutes meaningful experience, judging waking life as worthy of storage while treating the nocturnal theater of consciousness as disposable rehearsals. Consider the experience of waking from a vivid dream where you felt certain you would remember every detail, every color, every conversation, only to find that within minutes of opening your eyes, the entire narrative dissolves into fragments and then into nothing at all, leaving you grasping at wisps of imagery that slip away like water through cupped hands. This phenomenon may be fundamentally explained by understanding how our brain processes and stores information during different stages of sleep, particularly during the REM stage when most memorable dreams occur. During REM sleep, the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for logical thinking and memory consolidation, shows significantly reduced activity compared to the visual and emotional centers of the brain that light up with dream imagery. This neurological imbalance means that while dreams are being vividly experienced and emotionally charged in the moment, the brain lacks the necessary activation in its memory encoding regions to transfer these experiences into longer-term storage, treating them instead as temporary mental phenomena that exist only in the active working memory of sleep. When you wake, your brain must rapidly shift its neurological state, redirecting blood flow and activation back to the prefrontal cortex, and this transition itself appears to interrupt the fragile traces of dream information that were never firmly encoded in the first place. The short-term memory system that held the dream during sleep has nowhere to consolidate its contents into lasting recall because the neural conditions that would normally support that consolidation simply were not present. What makes this particularly persistent in human experience is that it happens so consistently and automatically that we have largely accepted it as an inevitable feature of sleep, rather than questioning whether our brains might actually be capable of retaining more dream content if the neurochemical conditions during REM sleep were different, or if we approached the transition to waking with greater intentionality. During the waking hours of our day, our brains maintain a delicate chemical balance that allows us to think clearly, focus intently, and process information with remarkable precision. And this equilibrium depends heavily upon the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which floods our prefrontal cortex and helps us maintain conscious awareness and deliberate thought. However, as we drift into sleep and progress through the various stages of the sleep cycle, our acetylcholine levels plummet dramatically, particularly during REM sleep when our dreams occur most vividly. And it is precisely during these moments of acetylcholine depletion that our brains seem least equipped to encode and consolidate the bizarre, emotionally charged narratives that unfold in our dreams. The theory suggests that our dreams fade from memory almost immediately upon waking because the neurochemical conditions necessary for memory formation have fundamentally changed. As acetylcholine surges back into our brains the instant we regain consciousness, and this sudden chemical shift creates what might be described as a neurochemical discontinuity between the dream state and the waking state. When we wake up, our brains must rapidly recalibrate, shifting from the acetylcholine-depleted dreaming brain to the acetylcholine-rich waking brain, and this abrupt transition may actually interfere with our ability to retrieve memories that were formed under completely different neurochemical circumstances, as if trying to read a document written in one language using the grammar and syntax of another. This theory has gained significant traction among neuroscientists because it explains why dream recall is so ephemeral and why dreams become harder to remember the longer we remain awake. And yet we continue to find this mechanism utterly unremarkable, rarely pausing to consider how profoundly our own brain chemistry determines what we will and will not remember about our own inner experiences. Accepting instead that forgetting our dreams is simply something that happens to us naturally, rather than recognizing it as a window into the deeper workings of consciousness itself. Consider the scenario of waking from a vivid nightmare, your heart racing and your mind flooded with disturbing imagery that feels overwhelmingly real in those first moments of consciousness. Yet within minutes or hours, that same dream has dissolved into obscurity, leaving only a vague impression of unease behind. From an evolutionary perspective, this systematic forgetting of dreams might represent an adaptive advantage that our species has retained across millennia, a mechanism that allowed our ancestors to process threatening scenarios and emotional challenges during sleep, while preventing those same anxieties from consuming their waking attention and decision-making capacity. The theory suggests that dreams function as a kind of psychological rehearsal, a safe space where our brains can simulate dangers, social conflicts, and survival threats without actual consequences. Yet if we retained perfect memory of these simulated catastrophes, we might spend our daylight hours paralyzed by phantom fears and second-hand trauma that never actually occurred in reality. By forgetting our dreams, we gain the therapeutic benefits of this nighttime processing, while remaining unburdened by the compulsive rumination that would result from constant recall of our most disturbing, shameful, or anxiety-inducing dream narratives. This selective amnesia for dreams but not for waking experiences represents an elegant evolutionary solution, preserving mental resources and emotional bandwidth for the immediate challenges of survival, reproduction, and social navigation that actually required our conscious attention and behavioral response. The mechanism persists today even though the specific survival threats our ancestors faced have largely diminished in modern civilization. Yet our brains continue operating according to these ancient algorithms, treating dreams as temporary emotional processing stations rather than information requiring permanent storage and integration into our autobiographical memory systems. Consider the phenomenon of waking from a vivid dream only to find that within moments, sometimes within mere seconds, the entire narrative dissolves from conscious memory like watercolor bleeding into blank canvas, leaving behind only a vague emotional residue and the frustrating sense that something important has slipped away. This experience is so universal, so consistently reported across cultures and centuries, that we rarely question why our brains would actively work to erase the very experiences we have just lived through in the darkness of sleep. The dream suppression mechanism suggests that our minds possess an inherent capacity, perhaps even a drive, to systematically remove dream content from long-term memory storage, prioritizing the waking state and its demands over the nocturnal narratives that once seemed so real and compelling. Neurologically speaking, the brain during REM sleep operates under fundamentally different chemical conditions than waking consciousness, with reduced levels of norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter critical for memory formation and retention, meaning that dreams are essentially being recorded in a medium designed for impermanence by default. Yet this explanation alone does not account for the remarkable speed with which dreams vanish, nor does it explain the selective nature of forgetting, where some dreams persist stubbornly in memory while others evaporate completely, suggesting an active suppression rather than passive decay. The psychological mechanism may involve the brain's need to compartmentalize sleep from waking life, to maintain clear boundaries between the uncontrolled narratives of sleep and the logical, sequential experiences of daylight hours, creating a protective barrier that prevents dream logic from contaminating waking cognition. Consider the moment when you wake in the morning, your eyes still heavy with sleep, your mind reaching back into the fog of the night that has just passed, grasping for the vivid narratives that seemed so real only moments before, only to find them dissolving like watercolor paintings left in the rain. This experience of dream loss has led some researchers to propose that cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, plays a significant role in erasing our nocturnal memories as we transition from sleep to wakefulness. The theory suggests that as dawn approaches and your body prepares for the demands of consciousness, cortisol levels naturally begin to rise in what is known as the cortisol awakening response, a circadian rhythm that primes your body for activity and alertness. As this hormone floods your system, it increases activation in certain brain regions while simultaneously suppressing activity in others, particularly affecting the hippocampus, the brain structure responsible for encoding memories into long-term storage. The mechanism operates on a neurochemical level, where elevated cortisol may interfere with the consolidation process that would normally transfer dream content from short-term memory into more durable neural pathways, essentially preventing the dream experiences from being filed away where they could be recalled throughout the day. What makes this theory particularly compelling is how it aligns with our observable behavior, as people who wake naturally without alarm clocks often report remembering more dreams than those jolted awake suddenly, since the gradual cortisol rise allows for a slower transition and potentially more memory encoding opportunities. Yet despite this plausible biological explanation, we continue to normalize the complete forgetting of our dreams as though it were inevitable and unchangeable, rarely questioning whether our modern habits of stress and rushed mornings might be exacerbating this natural process into something more extreme than our ancestors may have experienced. Consider the moment you wake in the morning with a vivid dream still clinging to your consciousness, crystalline and present, only to watch it dissolve within seconds like watercolor bleeding into white canvas, leaving behind only fragmentary impressions and a lingering emotional residue that feels increasingly unreal as you move through your morning routine. This experience, so universal that we rarely question it, forms the foundation of the fading trace theory, which proposes that dreams are not forgotten through active suppression or motivated forgetting, but rather because they are encoded in a fundamentally unstable neurological substrate that degrades rapidly once we transition from sleep to wakefulness. According to this framework, the brain chemistry that sustains dream consciousness during REM sleep, particularly the fluctuating levels of neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and acetylcholine, creates neural patterns that are inherently temporary and volatile, lacking the molecular stability required for long-term retention. When we wake, the neurochemical environment shifts dramatically, and these delicate dream memories, which were never consolidated into the robust structures that support ordinary waking memories, simply evaporate like morning fog beneath sunlight. The mechanism suggests that the neural activation patterns that constitute a dream experience are written in sand rather than stone, dependent on specific chemical conditions that vanish the moment consciousness changes its fundamental nature. What makes this theory particularly compelling is how it explains not just why we forget dreams, but why we forget them so completely and so quickly, why the act of trying to remember them often accelerates their dissolution, and why even vivid dreams that feel absolutely real and important in the moment can become utterly inaccessible minutes later. Imagine standing in a crowded marketplace where hundreds of conversations overlap simultaneously, where vendors call out their wares, where children laugh and cry in equal measure, yet somehow you manage to focus entirely on a single voice speaking to you across the noise. This is the fundamental capacity of human attention, a selective filter that determines what enters consciousness and what remains peripheral, and this very same mechanism appears to be at work during the transition into sleep, creating what neuroscientists refer to as attention gate closure. During the day, our brain actively maintains what researchers call the attentional gate, a metaphorical doorway that permits relevant information to pass into conscious awareness while blocking everything else, and this gate operates based on our immediate needs, interests, and survival priorities. However, as we approach sleep, this gate begins to gradually close in a systematic fashion, and dreams themselves become increasingly difficult to pass through this narrowing aperture of conscious attention. The mechanism is elegant in its simplicity. The neural systems responsible for maintaining active attention begin to disengage as sleep pressure increases, and as the neurotransmitter systems that support wakefulness diminish in their activity. Dreams are generated by regions of the brain that remain highly active during sleep, yet these dream experiences are created in a context where the very filters that would normally capture and encode them into memory are themselves becoming inoperative. The attention gate that would normally tag something as important and worthy of storage simply never opens wide enough to admit the dream material into the kind of consolidated memory that would allow us to recall it upon waking. We have normalized this phenomenon so completely that we rarely question it, accepting the frequent complaint of not remembering dreams as a simple inevitability of human consciousness, rather than as evidence of a profound but orderly reorganization of how our attention systems function during different states of awareness. Consider the peculiar experience of waking from a vivid dream only to find that within moments, sometimes seconds, the entire narrative has evaporated from consciousness, leaving behind only a faint emotional residue or a single fragmented image that dissolves further with each attempt to grasp it. We struggle to hold on to these nocturnal experiences, often finding that the harder we concentrate on remembering them, the faster they seem to slip away into oblivion. The reverse learning hypothesis proposes that this phenomenon occurs because our brains are actually engaged in the opposite process of what we typically understand as learning and memory consolidation. Rather than strengthening neural pathways during dreaming, the theory suggests that our brains are actively weakening and pruning unnecessary connections, essentially unlearning information that has been deemed irrelevant or counterproductive to our waking survival and functioning. In this framework, dreams represent a kind of neural housekeeping where the brain deliberately dismantles constructs that would otherwise clutter our cognitive landscape, and the natural forgetting of dreams is not a bug, but rather the intended feature of this maintenance operation. The mechanism works as follows. During rapid eye movement sleep, our brains cycle through accumulated information from the day, testing various neural combinations and associations without the constraints of logic or sensory input, and then systematically marking certain patterns for deletion or weakening rather than strengthening them. When we awaken, these recently weakened memories are inherently more fragile and resistant to conscious retrieval because the brain has essentially flagged them as low priority. This hypothesis explains why dream recall often feels like trying to read text written in disappearing ink, where the very act of trying to remember accelerates the forgetting process. During sleep, particularly in the deeper stages where dreams occur most vividly, our brains undergo a remarkable process of cellular maintenance and reorganization that researchers have termed synaptic pruning, and this biological housekeeping may fundamentally explain why dream memories vanish so completely upon waking. The theory suggests that our neural connections, which number in the trillions and form the substrate of all memory and thought, accumulate throughout the day in response to experience, learning, and environmental stimulation, gradually becoming more densely interconnected as we navigate waking consciousness. When we sleep, the brain enters a state where it systematically eliminates and weakens certain synaptic connections while strengthening others, essentially deciding which neural pathways merit preservation and which ones should be discarded as unnecessary information or noise that would otherwise clutter cognitive processing. Dreams, according to this framework, are perhaps the neurological byproduct of this pruning process itself, the mental static generated while the brain performs its essential maintenance work. And because the actual biological purpose of dreaming is not to create lasting memories, but rather to facilitate the sorting and elimination of irrelevant neural connections, the dream experience is deliberately designed by evolutionary pressures to be forgotten. The brain, in this view, actively suppresses the formation of stable dream memories because consolidating these experiences into long-term storage would defeat the entire purpose of the pruning process, which is to create a leaner, more efficient neural architecture. When we finally settle into bed after a long day of focused work, social interaction, and deliberate tasks, our brain undergoes a profound shift in its operational mode that most of us never consciously notice. The default mode network, a collection of interconnected brain regions that activate when we are not engaged in any specific external task, begins to dominate our neural activity as we transition towards sleep. This network, which includes areas like the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, is responsible for self-referential thinking, memory consolidation, and internal narrative generation. As we lie in bed with nothing particular demanding our attention, this network essentially comes online and begins to process the day's experiences, weaving together fragmented memories, emotional residues, and random neural firing patterns into something that resembles a coherent story. These stories are what we experience as dreams. However, as we transition deeper into sleep and move through different sleep stages, particularly as we approach and enter non-REM sleep, our brain chemistry shifts dramatically. Neurotransmitters like norepinephrine, which are crucial for memory encoding and conscious awareness, decline in concentration, while other neurochemical systems take precedence. The very mechanism that allowed us to generate and briefly experience these dream narratives becomes less capable of recording them into long-term memory storage. The default mode network itself becomes less prominent as different sleep stages take over, and the consolidation of dream memories requires a kind of metabolic priority that simply does not compete with the brain's primary sleep objectives. We forget our dreams not because they disappear from our minds mid-sleep, but because the neural conditions necessary for remembering them have fundamentally changed by the time we wake. The irony is that this forgetting mechanism is actually essential to healthy sleep and proper memory consolidation, yet we persist in treating forgotten dreams as a puzzle to solve rather than a necessary feature of good rest. Consider the precise moment when consciousness begins its return from sleep, that delicate threshold between the dream state and waking awareness where the mind exists in neither world fully, but rather suspended between them. During this waking transition, the brain undergoes a dramatic shift in neurochemical composition and neural activity patterns, moving from the predominantly theta wave activity of REM sleep toward the beta waves characteristic of full wakefulness. In those first seconds and minutes of awakening, the prefrontal cortex, which governs memory consolidation and logical reasoning, has not yet fully reactivated to baseline functioning. This means that the vivid, emotionally charged narrative content that constitutes our dreams exists in a state of extreme fragility, held only by the most temporary neural patterns that have not yet been reinforced through the normal processes of memory encoding. The sudden jolt of consciousness, whether triggered by an alarm clock, external noise, or simply the natural sleep cycle completion, creates what might be termed a neurological interruption that disrupts the delicate process by which short-term dream memories would otherwise transition into stable long-term storage. When we wake abruptly, we create a temporal gap where the brain essentially abandons the consolidation process midway through, leaving dream content to fade rapidly into irretrievable obscurity. What makes this phenomenon particularly persistent in human experience is that we have come to accept this loss as inevitable and even desirable, treating forgotten dreams as trivial rather than recognizing them as a direct result of the physiological violence we inflict upon the sleeping brain through the simple act of forcing ourselves awake. There exists a peculiar neurological state that occurs in those first moments after waking, a transitional zone where the mind remains partially submerged in the fog of sleep, even as the body begins to stir and the eyes flutter open to the morning light. During this period, which can last anywhere from several minutes to nearly an hour depending on the individual and the circumstances of their waking, a person experiences what researchers call sleep inertia, a temporary condition characterized by grogginess, confusion, and a profound difficulty in accessing memories or maintaining coherent thought. What happens in these moments is that the brain is caught between two incompatible states, with the neurochemical environment of sleep still lingering in the neural pathways, while the sensory systems gradually activate and begin flooding consciousness with new information about the waking world. The prefrontal cortex, which handles complex reasoning and memory retrieval, remains sluggish and less responsive, while the arousal systems slowly ramp up their activity levels, creating an uncomfortable mismatch between intention and capability. This biological lag is particularly pronounced when someone is awakened abruptly during deep sleep stages, as the contrast between the profound neural quietude of non-rapid eye movement sleep and the demands of wakefulness becomes especially stark and disorienting. What is remarkable about sleep inertia in relation to dreams is that this fog, this cognitive impairment, serves as a perfect neurological vacuum into which dream memories simply evaporate before they can be consolidated into longer-term storage, as if the dreams were written in a substance that dissolves instantly when exposed to the particular neurochemical environment of the transition between sleep states. Consider the moment when you drift from wakefulness into sleep, that threshold where your conscious mind gradually surrenders control and your awareness becomes fragmented and scattered across increasingly incoherent narratives. During this transition, your brain undergoes a fundamental shift in how it processes information and maintains a coherent sense of self, yet you remain largely unaware that this transformation is occurring until you find yourself already deep within a dream state. This discontinuity between your waking consciousness and your dreaming consciousness creates a natural barrier that prevents the seamless transfer of dream memories back into your waking mind, as if your sleeping brain and your waking brain are operating under entirely different sets of rules and priorities. The content you experience during sleep exists within a framework where logic is suspended, causality is irrelevant, and your sense of identity becomes malleable and uncertain. Yet when you awaken, your conscious mind suddenly reactivates with all its demands for rationality, coherence, and narrative structure, making the bizarre and illogical dreams seem increasingly foreign and difficult to retain. Neuroscientific research suggests that the neurochemical environment during sleep involves the reduction of norepinephrine and the altered balance of other neurotransmitters that are essential for memory consolidation in the way your waking brain understands it. meaning that dreams are literally being formed and forgotten within a different neurological context than the one responsible for your everyday memories. What persists most remarkably is how we have accepted this strange phenomenon as entirely natural and unremarkable, rarely questioning why it seems reasonable that we could spend 6 to 8 hours each night in vivid, elaborate experiences only to wake with almost nothing to show for it, treating this regular erasure of an entire realm of consciousness as simply the way humans are designed rather than as a profound and curious gap in our ability to remember ourselves. Consider the person who spends their entire waking day managing emotions, filtering reactions, maintaining composure in professional settings, suppressing frustration in traffic, swallowing disappointment in conversations, and carefully moderating their responses to the endless stream of stimuli that modern life presents to them. By the time evening arrives, this individual has accumulated an invisible psychological load, a weight of emotional restraint that has been methodically built throughout the day. When they lie down to sleep, their mind may attempt to process and discharge this accumulated emotional tension through dreams, creating vivid narratives that allow the psyche to express what the waking self has carefully contained. However, as sleep deepens and the brain transitions through its various stages, there may be a biological imperative to purge these processed emotions entirely, clearing the psychological slate so that the individual awakens refreshed rather than carrying the residual energy of their emotional work into the new day. The mechanism suggests that dreams serve as an initial processing chamber, a space where feelings can be symbolically enacted and worked through, but the actual forgetting of these dreams may represent a final cleansing phase where the brain chemically or neurologically erases the emotional scaffolding it constructed during the night, preventing the carryover of dream-based feelings into consciousness. This theory posits that we have somehow evolved or developed a system where emotional regulation requires both expression and erasure, where the mere fact of having processed something in dream form means the conscious memory of it becomes unnecessary and potentially counterproductive. We accept this phenomenon as natural despite its fundamental strangeness, rarely questioning why we would need to dream intensely about our emotional lives only to completely forget the content while retaining the subtle sense of emotional resolution that sometimes accompanies waking. Consider the experience of waking from a particularly vivid nightmare in which you were being chased through an unfamiliar landscape by an unknown pursuer, your heart racing, your palms damp with perspiration, every muscle tensed in preparation for fight or flight, only to find yourself safe in your bed in the calm darkness of your bedroom where nothing threatens you at all. Within moments, the urgent fear that gripped you begins to dissolve, not because you have consciously reasoned through the unreality of the dream, but because your nervous system is receiving direct sensory evidence that contradicts the simulation your sleeping brain constructed. The theory of threat simulation fading suggests that dreams, particularly those involving danger or pursuit, serve an evolutionary function as low-stakes rehearsals for real threats that might emerge in waking life, allowing your brain to practice threat response patterns without genuine risk. Yet when we awaken, this simulation loses its purpose instantaneously, because the very act of waking provides overwhelming proof that no actual threat exists in your immediate environment. Your brain's threat detection systems, which were fully activated during the dream state, begin to power down as sensory information floods in demonstrating safety. And this neurological shift may actually contribute to dream forgetting because the anxiety that helped encode the dream into memory is suddenly neutralized and replaced by the mundane reality of morning. The mechanism operates through a kind of psychological efficiency where threatening dreams served their purpose during sleep and are now metabolically expensive to maintain in memory, particularly once the survival-relevant information they contained has been superseded by actual environmental data. Our working memory operates as a severely constrained system, capable of holding only a handful of distinct pieces of information simultaneously before they begin to fade or become overwritten by new incoming data. When we awaken from sleep, our brains must transition from the neurochemical state of dreaming, where the prefrontal cortex operates at reduced capacity, to a fully conscious waking state where executive function suddenly demands attention to immediate environmental stimuli, bodily sensations, and the pressing concerns of daily life. In this critical transition window, dreams exist in a fragile form within our short-term memory stores, competing for space against the flood of new information that consciousness brings. The working memory system can only maintain so many competing narratives at once, and when real-world demands surge upon waking, the dream content becomes displaced from these limited storage slots. The prefrontal cortex, which is essential for both maintaining working memory and consolidating experiences into long-term storage, has not yet fully reactivated in the minutes immediately following sleep, meaning dreams lack the neural infrastructure needed to be properly encoded and retained. Additionally, dreams themselves are often internally inconsistent and lack the logical structure that our waking minds use as hooks for memory retention. A dream involving a childhood home that simultaneously exists in your current city, combined with a person who is somehow both your friend and a stranger, provides no coherent narrative framework for the working memory system to grasp and hold onto. Within moments of waking, the conscious mind prioritizes processing actual environmental information, social cues, and temporal awareness, pushing the dream's unstable representations further into obscurity. Our bodies operate on a carefully calibrated internal clock, a 24-hour cycle that has evolved over millions of years to synchronize our physiology with the rotation of the Earth. And this circadian rhythm governs not only when we feel alert or drowsy, but also the precise timing of hormone release, body temperature fluctuations, and the intricate neurochemical dance that prepares us for sleep. When we attempt to fall asleep, our brain expects certain conditions to align with our circadian phase, including decreasing cortisol levels, rising melatonin production, and a gradual lowering of core body temperature. Yet our modern lifestyles frequently introduce artificial lights, irregular schedules, and stimulating activities that desynchronize these biological expectations. The theory suggests that our dreams become forgotten precisely because they occur during the circadian phases when our neurochemical environment is optimized for sleep consolidation rather than memory encoding, meaning that the very conditions that help us transition into deep, restorative sleep simultaneously suppress the neural mechanisms required to transfer dream content from short-term to long-term memory storage. During the later sleep cycles, when rapid eye movement sleep becomes more prevalent and dreams become more vivid and narratively complex, our brain chemistry has shifted so profoundly toward sleep maintenance that the standard pathways for memory formation operate at their lowest capacity, creating a biological window where dream experiences simply cannot gain traction in our conscious record. Consider the peculiar nature of dreams themselves, how their narratives shift and transform with each passing moment of sleep, how a coherent scene dissolves into fragmented imagery only to reconstitute itself into something entirely different moments later. This instability in dream content presents a fascinating paradox when we contemplate memory formation and retention, because our brains appear fundamentally designed to preserve stable, consistent information. Yet dreams operate according to an entirely different set of rules, where logic collapses and narrative threads scatter like disturbed fish in shallow water. When we attempt to remember a dream upon waking, we are essentially trying to grasp something that was never meant to remain stable in the first place, something that existed in a state of constant flux and metamorphosis while we slept, and this fundamental incompatibility between the dream's nature and our memory's preference for stability may be the very mechanism that facilitates forgetting. The dream content is so inherently unstable that our brain's memory consolidation processes struggle to find purchase, to identify which elements matter and which are merely ephemeral noise, and in this uncertainty, the entire experience simply dissolves. Furthermore, the neurotransmitter environment during REM sleep, particularly the depletion of norepinephrine, creates conditions where stable memory encoding becomes biochemically challenging. And when combined with the unstable, constantly shifting nature of dream narratives themselves, forgetting becomes not a failure of memory, but rather an inevitable consequence of the dream's own instability. We have come to accept this forgetting as natural, as simply part of how dreams work, rarely questioning whether the instability of dream content itself might be precisely what our brain evolved to ensure we would not remember, to maintain a clear distinction between the stable world of waking consciousness and the turbulent, unreliable realm of sleep. Throughout the night, our brains experience countless moments of brief consciousness that we rarely remember upon waking, fleeting instances where we drift just barely across the threshold of awareness before sinking back into deeper sleep. And according to this theory, these micro-awakenings might be the very mechanism responsible for erasing our dreams from memory before we fully surrender to sleep. When we experience these brief arousals, which can last anywhere from a few seconds to perhaps half a minute, our brain appears to reset itself in ways that interfere with the consolidation of dream memories into long-term storage, essentially creating a neurological checkpoint where dream content is vulnerable to dissolution. The theory suggests that as we cycle through different sleep stages and our brain naturally fluctuates between deeper and lighter phases of rest, these micro-awakenings create small windows of interruption that prevent the neural pathways associated with our dreams from becoming sufficiently encoded and stable enough to survive into wakefulness. In essence, the dream memories are still being formed in the moments before these micro-awakenings occur, but the momentary surge in conscious awareness, however subtle and undetectable it might be, disrupts the delicate process of memory consolidation that would normally allow us to recall these experiences after we wake. This explanation carries particular appeal because it accounts for the strange phenomenological experience many people report of feeling as though they almost remember a dream, sensing its presence at the edges of consciousness without being able to grasp it, and the micro-awakenings theory provides a plausible neurological basis for this sensation of near remembrance. Consider the peculiar reality of waking from a vivid dream with complete recall, only to find that within minutes, sometimes even seconds, the entire narrative dissolves into fog, leaving behind only a vague emotional residue or a single fragmented image that refuses to solidify into coherent memory. This phenomenon happens so consistently across humanity that we barely pause to question why our minds possess the apparent ability to construct entire worlds with narrative logic, character development, and sensory detail, yet systematically discard these creations the moment consciousness reasserts its dominance. The consciousness reboot hypothesis proposes that this forgetting is not a failure of memory, but rather an intentional neurocognitive reset, a deliberate clearing of the slate that occurs as the brain transitions from the diffuse, nonlinear processing state of sleep back to the focused, linear, goal-oriented architecture required for waking consciousness. In this framework, dreams are understood as the byproducts of a system essentially rebooting itself, reorganizing neural connections, consolidating certain memories while deliberately pruning others, and this pruning extends to the dream narratives themselves, which serve their purpose during sleep but become incompatible with the precise, efficient cognitive demands of daytime awareness. The mechanism suggests that maintaining dream memories at the same vividness and accessibility as waking memories would create cognitive interference, introducing illogical narratives and symbolic content into the rational decision-making processes that waking life requires, and therefore the brain has evolved to systematically downweight and degrade dream memories as part of the transition process itself. Consider the peculiar phenomenon wherein we wake from sleep with only fragments of our dreams intact, while simultaneously retaining crystal-clear memories of mundane details from our waking hours, such as the exact layout of our morning commute or the precise words spoken by a colleague during an afternoon meeting. This selective retention pattern, often attributed to the brain's filtering mechanisms during the transition between sleep states, suggests that our minds engage in an active process of determining what deserves to be remembered and what ought to be discarded or obscured. The neurological reality involves the rapid depletion of norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter critical for memory formation, during REM sleep when most vivid dreams occur, meaning that the biological architecture of sleep itself conspires against the consolidation of dream content into long-term storage. Yet beyond this chemical explanation exists a deeper psychological mechanism wherein the brain perpetually evaluates information based on perceived relevance and survival value. And since dreams present no immediate practical utility in our modern existence, they are systematically deprioritized during the memory filing process that occurs as we cross the threshold into wakefulness. What becomes fascinating is how thoroughly this selective filtering operates without our conscious awareness or protest, as we have simply accepted the loss of our nocturnal narratives as inevitable and unremarkable, rarely questioning why our brains seem designed to forget the very experiences that occupy roughly one-third of our lives. We have normalized this forgetting so completely that we speak of dreams as ephemeral and unreliable, rather than interrogating why evolution would construct such an elaborate neural dismissal system. And this normalization persists despite the illogic of investing such significant neural resources into creating immersive, emotionally charged experiences only to systematically erase them from memory within moments of awakening. Consider the experience of drifting towards sleep, when your mind seems to fill with fragments of disconnected imagery, abstract sensations, and fleeting thoughts that bear no relation to one another or to your waking concerns. The neural noise theory proposes that dreams themselves, or more precisely, our inability to retain them, stem from the brain's natural tendency to generate random electrical activity during sleep, particularly during the REM phases when most vivid dreaming occurs. As your conscious mind begins to shut down and your brain transitions between different states of neurological activity, the neural pathways that ordinarily filter and organize information become less active, allowing a cascade of what neuroscientists term noise to flow through the system without the organizing principle of rational thought. This noise consists of random firings of neurons, spontaneous activations of memory networks, and the brain's own internal communication becoming increasingly chaotic and unpatterned compared to waking consciousness. Dreams emerge from this neural noise as your brain attempts to construct narrative sense from fundamentally meaningless signals, like trying to hear a conversation in a room filled with static. When you awaken, the mechanisms responsible for encoding these dream narratives into long-term memory have not fully engaged because they were designed primarily to capture information relevant to survival and daily function, not the random byproducts of a sleeping brain's electrical misfirings. The theory suggests that forgetting dreams is not a failure of memory, but rather the system working as intended, discarding the noise and preserving only what the brain determines to be genuinely significant. Yet despite the logical elegance of this explanation, that we forget dreams simply because they are neurological noise unworthy of retention, we continue to ascribe meaning to them, to collect them, to discuss them, to build entire interpretive frameworks around phenomena that may be nothing more than the sound of our own brains processing static. When the amygdala, that almond-shaped structure deep within the brain responsible for processing fear and emotional responses, becomes hyperactive during the evening hours, it can trigger a cascade of neurological events that fundamentally alters our capacity to retain dream memories. During times of heightened stress, anxiety, or accumulated emotional tension throughout the day, the amygdala remains in an elevated state of vigilance, continuing to scan the environment for potential threats even as we drift towards sleep. This persistent activation means that when REM sleep arrives and dreams begin to unfold, the amygdala is essentially sending competing signals throughout the brain, creating a kind of neural static that interferes with the consolidation and encoding of dream imagery into long-term memory. Rather than allowing the natural dream narratives to settle into the hippocampus, where they might be recalled upon waking, an overactive amygdala essentially drowns out these delicate neural patterns with its own insistent emotional broadcasts. The mechanism is not one of active suppression, but rather one of overwhelming interference, where the brain's threat detection system is working so hard that it cannot simultaneously process and store the abstract, metaphorical content of dreams. We have grown accustomed to living with this heightened state of amygdala activation, accepting it as simply the price of modern living without questioning whether our nervous systems were ever designed to remain in such a state of readiness. The irony lies in how we normalize this condition, treating chronic anxiety and emotional hypervigilance as inevitable rather than recognizing them as disruptions to natural sleep architecture. Over time, many people develop an expectation that they simply cannot remember their dreams, never realizing that their amygdala's overactivity may be the primary architect of this forgetting, a constant low-level alarm system that, in protecting us from perceived danger, simultaneously prevents us from accessing the restorative and psychologically integrative function that dreams are meant to provide. Consider the mental state of someone lying in bed at the end of an exhausting day, their mind already saturated with information from work emails, conversations, news feeds, social media updates, and countless decisions made throughout their waking hours. When this person attempts to recall or focus on their dreams from the night before, they encounter a peculiar phenomenon. The dreams seem to dissolve almost immediately, not because they were never formed, but because their conscious mind lacks the available processing capacity to encode, organize, and store these ephemeral experiences into long-term memory. The brain, already operating at maximum cognitive capacity from the demands of modern life, cannot simultaneously maintain the neural resources needed to hold dreams in awareness, while also managing the overwhelming influx of new information competing for attention. This cognitive load overload creates a bottleneck in the dream recall system, where the neural pathways that would normally consolidate and strengthen dream memories become deprioritized in favor of processing and storing information deemed more immediately relevant to survival and daily functioning. The brain operates on a principle of triage, allocating its limited attentional resources to what seems most pressing, and dreams simply do not register as urgent compared to the 1,000 other data points demanding cognitive engagement. What makes this phenomenon particularly interesting is how we have normalized this state of cognitive saturation in contemporary life, accepting as inevitable that our minds feel perpetually full, that our attention spans fragment throughout the day, and that dreams slip away because we simply do not have mental space left to grasp them. We rarely pause to question whether this constant cognitive overload is actually necessary, or whether we have unconsciously surrendered our capacity to remember the rich inner worlds generated during sleep simply because we cannot afford the mental resources to do so. Consider the person who wakes in the morning with fragments of vivid dreams still clinging to their consciousness, yet by the time they finish brushing their teeth and preparing for the day, those dreams have vanished almost entirely, leaving only a vague sense of having dreamed something without any concrete memory of what it was. This phenomenon of dream forgetting might not be a failure of memory at all, but rather an elegantly designed adaptive function that our brains have developed over millennia to help us transition efficiently from the sleeping state into waking consciousness and daily functioning. The theory suggests that dreams, with their bizarre logic, emotional intensity, and often contradictory narratives, represent a form of cognitive processing that is fundamentally incompatible with the structured, goal-oriented thinking required for survival and social interaction in the waking world. Rather than cluttering our working memory with the strange imagery and illogical sequences that characterize dreams, our brains may have evolved to systematically purge this information upon waking, creating mental space and cognitive resources for the immediate demands of conscious life. This adaptive forgetting function would serve as a kind of mental reset mechanism, ensuring that we do not carry over the dreamlike, associative thinking patterns into our waking hours, where they would interfere with practical problem-solving, social communication, and rational decision-making. The neurotransmitter changes that occur during the transition from REM sleep to wakefulness, particularly the shift in norepinephrine and acetylcholine levels, may actively suppress the consolidation of dream memories into long-term storage, essentially deleting information that the brain has determined to be irrelevant to waking life. Consider the jarring experience of being pulled from sleep by an alarm clock, that sudden electronic shriek or aggressive buzzing that tears through the fabric of your dreams without warning or mercy, and how this abrupt awakening creates a psychological rupture so complete that the dream narrative dissolves almost instantly from conscious memory. The alarm clock serves as a temporal boundary between two worlds, a harsh demarcation between the sleeping mind and the waking world, and in that violent transition, the delicate threads of REM sleep and dream imagery are severed so quickly that your brain simply cannot consolidate these ephemeral experiences into retrievable memories. When you are jolted awake, your autonomic nervous system floods your body with cortisol and adrenaline, stress hormones designed to activate your fight or flight response. And this neurochemical surge essentially overwrites the gentle, diffuse neurological state that was allowing you to experience dreams in the first place. The dream, which existed in a particular frequency of brainwave activity and neural connectivity, is abruptly interrupted before it can be properly encoded into long-term memory, leaving only fragmented impressions that fade within seconds of waking. What makes this phenomenon particularly persistent in our modern lives is that we have accepted the alarm clock as simply the cost of maintaining schedules and productivity, treating this violent interruption as normal and necessary rather than recognizing it as fundamentally at odds with the gentle, organic process of natural awakening that would allow dreams to linger in consciousness. We have normalized the interruption itself, built our entire relationship with sleep around the assumption that we must be shocked awake rather than allowed to emerge naturally. And in doing so, we have ensured that the dream world remains largely inaccessible to us, locked away behind the barrier of that urgent, unforgiving sound that demands our immediate surrender to the demands of the waking world. There exists a peculiar phenomenon that many of us experience in those moments just before we slip into sleep, where a sudden jolt of alertness pulls us back from the threshold of unconsciousness, causing our eyes to snap open and our body to tense with an almost involuntary startle response that feels entirely unbidden and impossible to control. This jarring interruption, which researchers refer to as the sudden awakening effect, represents a fascinating collision between our conscious desire to rest and an ancient protective mechanism that our nervous system maintains even as we approach the vulnerable state of sleep. And it happens with remarkable frequency during the very moments when we are most earnestly trying to remember or process the fragmented narratives of our dreams from previous nights. The physiological explanation for this phenomenon involves a complex interplay between two competing neural systems within our brain, specifically the interaction between the reticular activating system, which governs our alertness and vigilance, and the mechanisms responsible for the onset of rapid eye movement sleep. And when these systems encounter what they interpret as a potentially threatening shift in consciousness or an unexpected dip in awareness, they trigger a defensive response that essentially resurrects full wakefulness as a protective measure. The sudden awakening effect appears to serve an evolutionary purpose rooted in our species' need to remain vigilant even during moments of transition, as if our primitive brain fears that the act of surrendering to sleep leaves us defenseless against predators or environmental hazards, and this ancient survival instinct remains embedded within our modern neurology, despite the fact that most of us face no genuine threats while lying safely in our beds at home. Some people wake from sleep and immediately recall vivid narratives, emotional landscapes, and intricate scenarios that played out in their minds throughout the night, while others open their eyes to complete blankness, as though their consciousness simply switched off and then back on again without any intermediate content to retrieve. This observable difference in dream recall ability has led researchers and psychologists to investigate whether the capacity to remember dreams might be linked to fundamental personality characteristics that extend far beyond sleep itself. The evidence suggests that individuals who score higher on measures of openness to experience, creativity, and introspection tend to report significantly better dream recall than their counterparts, which implies that the act of remembering dreams might be less about the neurological capability to form memories during REM sleep and more about the psychological predisposition to attend to, value, and process internal subjective experiences. People who are naturally inclined toward self-reflection, artistic expression, and the exploration of their own mental states appear to create stronger neural pathways for capturing and consolidating dream memories, while those oriented toward external reality, practical concerns, and objective tasks may naturally prioritize waking consciousness over the ephemeral content of sleep. This personality-based framework suggests that dream recall functions partly as an expression of how individuals fundamentally relate to their inner worlds, with some personalities naturally gravitating toward the abstract and subjective, while others remain focused on the concrete and observable. Yet despite understanding this relationship between personality and dream recall, we continue to treat dream remembering as though it were simply a matter of individual effort or technique, recommending journal keeping and intention setting as universal solutions without acknowledging that for some temperaments, forgetting dreams upon waking might represent their natural and perhaps even psychologically healthy default state. Consider the neurochemical reality of someone lying in bed at night, their mind restless and alert, unable to transition into the passive state required for sleep, and you begin to understand how dopamine, the brain's motivation and reward neurotransmitter, plays a crucial role in the architecture of consciousness during sleep onset. During waking hours, dopamine levels remain relatively elevated, keeping us engaged with our environment, focused on goals, and responsive to stimuli both internal and external. But as evening approaches and sleep becomes necessary, dopamine naturally decreases to allow other neurochemical systems to take precedence, particularly those involving serotonin and melatonin, which facilitate the downregulation of conscious awareness. When dopamine signaling remains too active or fails to decline appropriately, the brain struggles to disengage from the reward-seeking patterns that characterize wakefulness. And instead of allowing memories and experiences to consolidate naturally during sleep, the neural circuits responsible for encoding and retrieving dreams remain somewhat activated, keeping dream experiences closer to conscious awareness than they would ordinarily be. The mechanism operates through the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, regions deeply implicated in both motivation and memory formation, where reduced dopamine allows the default mode network to shift into a more introspective, less goal-oriented state. Yet when dopamine remains elevated or dysregulated, this network continues firing in patterns associated with wakefulness, potentially interfering with the selective amnesia that typically characterizes the dream-to-waking transition. Consider the moment you wake from sleep, reaching desperately for the fragments of a dream that seemed so vivid mere seconds before, only to find that the narrative dissolves like watercolor in your conscious mind, leaving behind only impressions and vague emotional residues that fade further with each passing moment of wakefulness. This phenomenon, known as memory trace decay, describes the gradual weakening and deterioration of the neural pathways that encode dream experiences, a process that begins the instant you open your eyes and accelerates as your brain transitions from the neurochemical environment of sleep to the demanding attention requirements of consciousness. During REM sleep, when most vivid dreams occur, your brain operates under a fundamentally different chemical regime, with dramatically reduced levels of norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter crucial for memory formation and consolidation, which means that the neural patterns created during dreaming lack the biochemical reinforcement necessary to burn them into long-term memory the way waking experiences are encoded. The memory traces established during dreams are inherently fragile, temporary inscriptions written in a brain that is chemically predisposed toward impermanence. And when you transition to wakefulness, you simultaneously switch to a neurochemical state where those traces can no longer be adequately maintained or strengthened. Furthermore, the very act of waking involves an abrupt shift in consciousness that disrupts the associative networks that link dream elements together, causing the interconnected web of memories to unravel before your conscious mind can grasp it sufficiently to translate it into stable, retrievable form. Consider the precise moment when your consciousness begins to slip away from wakefulness and enters the first stages of sleep, that liminal space where thoughts become increasingly scattered and your awareness of the external world dims considerably. During this transition between wakefulness and stage 1 sleep, your brain is actively engaged in a remarkable process of neurological reorganization, shifting from the patterns associated with conscious thought to the slower, more rhythmic patterns of sleep itself. Within this transition period, any dreams that may have begun forming are typically quite fragmented and lack the narrative coherence of later REM stage dreams, yet they are somehow less accessible to memory upon waking. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears to involve the sudden decrease in norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter critical for memory formation and the consolidation of experiences into long-term storage. As your brain chemistry shifts during the sleep stage transition, the neural pathways responsible for encoding new memories become increasingly deprioritized, essentially closing the door on whatever mental content was occurring just moments before. Furthermore, the transition itself represents a kind of cognitive discontinuity, a break in the continuity of consciousness so profound that the brain may simply categorize anything from this threshold period as belonging to neither waking memory nor the more vivid dreams of later sleep stages. What makes this phenomenon particularly interesting is how universally we accept this loss without question, rarely questioning why our minds would systematically discard mental experiences occurring at such a specific and predictable moment in our sleep cycle, as though evolution deliberately designed us to forget precisely at this juncture. Deep within the brain, beneath the layers of cortex and conscious thought, lies the brainstem, a primitive structure responsible for regulating fundamental survival functions like breathing, heart rate, and arousal. When we drift toward sleep, this brainstem undergoes a remarkable transformation in its activation patterns, shifting from the alert, responsive state required for waking consciousness into a mode characterized by reduced norepinephrine and serotonin production, neurochemicals that normally maintain our vigilance and awareness. During this transitional period, the brainstem's locus coeruleus, a small region packed with neurons that fire rapidly during wakefulness, begins to quiet its activity substantially, creating a neurochemical environment where the filtering and consolidation of memories becomes possible. The mechanism appears to operate as follows. As the brainstem gradually disengages from its waking responsibilities, it simultaneously reduces the intensity of its ascending projections to the cortex, the very signals that normally amplify and strengthen the neural patterns we experience as conscious thought and memory. In this dimmed state, dream experiences, which are generated through random activation of various cortical regions during REM sleep, fail to be encoded into long-term memory with the same fidelity as waking experiences, because the brainstem's reduced arousal signals do not provide the neurochemical reinforcement needed for those neural patterns to solidify into retrievable memories. What persists as remarkable is how universally we accept this phenomenon despite never receiving explicit instruction about it, how we simply wake without recollection and move forward with our days, treating this massive nightly loss of experience as natural and unremarkable rather than peculiar. As though the brainstem's quieting mechanisms represent not a specific biological adaptation, but rather an inevitable and unchangeable feature of human sleep that requires neither explanation nor concern. Consider the curious phenomenon of how our brains seem to actively diminish dream recall the moment consciousness returns, as though some ancient mechanism within us has deemed certain nocturnal narratives unfit for waking awareness. And this pattern suggests that dream suppression may not be a bug in our cognitive system, but rather a feature that evolved over millennia to serve specific survival purposes. In the ancestral environment, early humans who entered rapid eye movement sleep experienced vivid hallucinations and complex narratives that could have easily confused reality with imagination. And those individuals who could rapidly flush these experiences from memory upon waking may have maintained sharper focus on genuine threats and opportunities in their physical surroundings, creating a competitive advantage over those who lingered in dream-addled states throughout the morning hours. The neurological pathway for this suppression likely involves the rapid degradation of norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter crucial for memory formation, which naturally plummets during REM sleep and takes considerable time to rebuild as we transition into wakefulness, meaning that dreams recorded in this neurochemically impoverished environment simply fail to integrate into our autobiographical memory systems with the same persistence as waking experiences. What makes this evolutionary holdover particularly fascinating is that modern humans have largely transcended the survival pressures that made dream forgetting advantageous. Yet the mechanism persists with remarkable consistency across populations and cultures, suggesting that once such a profound cognitive adaptation becomes embedded in our neural architecture, it proves far more difficult to unwind than one might expect from a purely rational perspective. Consider the person who wakes in the middle of the night, heart racing, sheets soaked with perspiration, the vivid memory of a nightmare still clinging to their consciousness like morning fog that refuses to lift, and yet within minutes, sometimes even seconds, that terrible dream begins to dissolve into fragments and then disappears entirely, leaving behind only the physiological aftermath of fear and the nagging sense that something disturbing had occurred without any clear recollection of what it was. This phenomenon has prompted researchers and sleep theorists to propose what might be called the nightmare protection theory, which suggests that our minds actively suppress or rapidly decay the memories of our most distressing dreams as a psychological defense mechanism designed to protect us from the sustained emotional trauma that would result if we maintained clear and detailed memories of our nightmares throughout the waking day. The mechanism behind this theory operates on the principle that consciousness, when it returns during the arousal process, encounters the remnants of traumatic dream content and essentially quarantines those memories, preventing them from integrating fully into our accessible long-term memory storage, much the way our minds might suppress traumatic real-world events as a survival adaptation. The reasoning suggests that if we were forced to retain vivid memories of our nightmares with the same clarity that we maintain other dreams, we would carry forward the anxiety, dread, and distress generated during sleep into our waking hours, creating a psychological burden that would accumulate over time and potentially impair our cognitive function and emotional well-being. This theory normalizes the otherwise paradoxical experience of feeling profoundly disturbed by a nightmare while simultaneously being unable to articulate or remember its specific content, positioning dream forgetting not as a random neurological accident, but as an intelligent protective system that our minds have evolved to implement selectively, protecting us from ourselves by erasing the very thing that troubles us most in the darkness. Consider the moment just before sleep takes hold, when your mind begins to drift away from conscious awareness and your thoughts become increasingly fragmented and difficult to grasp. And in this liminal space between wakefulness and sleep, some researchers propose that your brain is engaged in intensive background processing that actually requires the temporary suspension of dream recall mechanisms. The theory suggests that during the transition into deeper sleep stages, your unconscious mind is actively working through the day's accumulated information, emotions, and experiences at a level so fundamental and demanding that consciously remembering your dreams would essentially interrupt this crucial cognitive housekeeping process. Much like trying to maintain a conversation while your computer is running a critical system update that demands all available processing power. In this framework, forgetting dreams is not a failure of memory, but rather a feature of an optimally functioning mind that has temporarily deprioritized dream recall in order to allocate resources toward deeper integration of memories, emotional regulation, and the consolidation of learning that occurs beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. The brain, according to this perspective, makes a calculated decision to suppress dream accessibility during the night's deepest work, understanding on some fundamental level that the cognitive effort required to maintain dream recall would create interference patterns that could disrupt the very processing that needs to happen most urgently. This theory explains why people often awaken with a sense of having processed something important during the night without any actual memory of the dreams themselves, and why some individuals who interrupt their sleep frequently or use certain substances that disrupt sleep architecture often report having fewer dreams, when in reality their dreams may simply be more difficult to access due to the interference with the underlying unconscious processing that would normally keep them inaccessible. Consider the experience of waking from a vivid dream only to find that within moments, the narrative dissolves like watercolor in rain, leaving behind only an emotional residue and fragmentary images that resist coherent reconstruction. You lie in bed, acutely aware that something significant occupied your mind just seconds before, yet the harder you grasp for the details, the faster they evaporate into the unconscious mind. Sigmund Freud proposed that this forgetting is not merely a passive failure of memory, but rather an active psychological process of repression, wherein the conscious mind deliberately obscures dreams that contain threatening, unacceptable, or deeply disturbing content. According to this theory, our dreams often express primitive desires, violent impulses, sexual fantasies, and traumatic memories that our waking consciousness finds intolerable, and therefore the psyche employs repression as a protective mechanism, ensuring these forbidden narratives remain inaccessible to our rational awareness. The dream itself serves as a compromise formation, disguising these unacceptable wishes in symbolic language so they can be processed during sleep without overwhelming the ego. Yet upon waking, the conscious mind erects additional barriers, actively suppressing the dream content to maintain psychological equilibrium and social acceptability. The mechanism operates seamlessly because the repressed material never fully enters consciousness. It remains at the threshold between sleeping and waking states, touched but not fully grasped. We have come to accept dream forgetting as entirely natural, a quirk of neurology rather than questioning whether our minds might be protecting us from knowledge we are psychologically unprepared to integrate. This normalization persists despite the peculiar selectivity of dream amnesia, wherein emotionally charged nightmares sometimes persist vividly while mundane dreams vanish completely, suggesting that emotional significance and psychological threat play crucial roles in determining what surfaces and what sinks back into the depths of our unconscious mind. According to Jungian psychology, dreams serve as a primary language through which the unconscious mind communicates with consciousness, using symbols and archetypal imagery that carry profound personal and collective meaning. When we awaken, these symbols, the shadowy figures, the transformative animals, the mysterious landscapes, begin to dissolve almost immediately from our accessible memory, as though the unconscious deliberately withdraws its message the moment we cross back into waking awareness. A person might vividly experience a dream populated with rich symbolic content: a wise old mentor figure, a dangerous threshold to cross, a garden that represents potential growth, or a mirror reflecting an unfamiliar version of oneself. Yet within minutes of opening their eyes, these meaningful images fade into vague impressions and emotional echoes that resist concrete articulation. The mechanism behind this phenomenon, from a Jungian perspective, suggests that the symbolic language of dreams operates in a fundamentally different neural and cognitive register than waking consciousness. and that the transition between these states involves a kind of translation failure where the deep symbolic content cannot be adequately encoded into the linguistic and conceptual frameworks of the waking mind. The symbols lose their vivid charge not because they were never meaningful, but because the symbolic processing capacity of the dreaming brain simply cannot maintain its intensity once the rational, verbal systems of waking consciousness reassert dominance. Yet despite understanding this mechanism, we continue to experience this loss without resistance, having normalized the idea that dreams are inherently fleeting and ephemeral experiences that cannot be permanently captured, when in reality we might preserve them through immediate writing or conscious intention, suggesting that some part of us has accepted, perhaps even internalized, the unconscious's apparent preference for keeping its symbolic messages temporary and elusive. Consider the moment when you lie in bed at night, your mind still active with the events of the day, with conversations replayed and anxieties circling, and then you consciously decide to stop engaging with these thoughts entirely, to let them dissolve into the darkness of sleep. What you're attempting to do in that moment is to reset the neural pathways that have been firing throughout your waking hours, to essentially interrupt the patterns of thought that keep your brain alert and engaged with conscious processing. The theory suggests that dreams themselves, those strange narratives that emerge during REM sleep, may actually serve as a mechanism for this resetting process, and that the forgetting of dreams upon waking might be a necessary consequence of that reset occurring rather than a failure of memory. Your brain, in this interpretation, is quite literally rewiring itself during sleep, creating new connections while pruning away others, and the dream content itself becomes irrelevant to the actual work being done at the neurological level. The act of forgetting the dream is not a flaw in this system, but perhaps its most elegant feature, because if you remembered every detail of every dream with perfect clarity, your brain would never truly complete its reset. You would be holding onto the neural patterns you were trying to clear away in the first place. This explanation appeals to a certain logical elegance, suggesting that forgetfulness is not a bug but a feature, that the ephemeral nature of dreams serves a purpose we have yet to fully understand. Yet despite the intuitive appeal of this theory, we continue to feel frustrated by our inability to recall our dreams. We write down dream journals hoping to capture something we feel should be preserved. We practice lucid dreaming techniques to maintain consciousness through the reset process, acting as though remembering our dreams is inherently valuable without questioning whether that remembrance might actually interfere with the very function those dreams were designed to perform. Consider the modern human consciousness at the end of a typical day, saturated with an unprecedented volume of information that would have seemed incomprehensible to our ancestors, who encountered perhaps dozens of distinct pieces of knowledge across an entire lifetime. We have absorbed countless emails, notifications, social media updates, news headlines, conversations, images, videos, and abstract concepts throughout our waking hours, each one competing for storage space within the finite architecture of our working memory and long-term retention systems. Our brains, having been engineered through millions of years of evolution to survive in environments with far more limited information density, find themselves overwhelmed by this relentless cascade of data points that demand attention, processing, and response. The phenomenon of dream forgetting can be understood as an extension of a fundamental cognitive survival mechanism, one in which the brain acts as a sophisticated filtering system designed to distinguish between information that deserves permanent storage and information that represents noise, redundancy, or temporary processing that serves no essential function. When we enter the dream state during REM sleep, our mind is essentially processing, reorganizing, and discarding vast quantities of information accumulated during waking consciousness, and the dreams themselves become a form of cognitive debris, a byproduct of this ruthless internal filing system that determines what gets archived and what gets deleted. The brain, in its infinite pragmatism, recognizes that dreams possess no survival value and that remembering them would only add another layer of unnecessary information to an already overburdened neural network that is struggling to distinguish between essential data and the mundane noise of daily existence. Within the intricate architecture of the brain lies a structure called the thalamus, often described as the brain's relay station, positioned strategically between the sensory organs and the cerebral cortex, filtering and directing the vast streams of information that constantly bombard our consciousness throughout waking hours. According to the thalamus gatekeeping theory, this remarkable structure maintains its filtering function even as we transition into sleep, serving as a gatekeeper that actively suppresses and redirects the dream narratives being generated by the sleeping brain before they can be consolidated into stable memories that we might otherwise recall upon waking. When we fall asleep, the thalamus does not simply cease its operations, but rather shifts into a different mode of operation, becoming more selective and restrictive about which neural signals receive the necessary amplification and routing to reach the cortical areas responsible for memory formation and conscious awareness. The mechanism operates on the principle that during REM sleep, when most vivid dreaming occurs, the thalamus essentially dampens the signal strength of dream content being transmitted from the limbic system and brainstem regions, preventing these electrochemical patterns from achieving the threshold intensity required for long-term memory encoding. This gatekeeping function appears to serve an adaptive purpose, as allowing every fragmented dream narrative to be permanently stored would quickly overwhelm our cognitive systems with irrelevant and often emotionally chaotic information that would clutter the memory systems needed for survival-relevant learning and consolidation of important daytime experiences. The persistence of this theory in our understanding of dream amnesia speaks to a deeper truth about how the brain manages its enormous information processing demands, employing selective attention and deliberate forgetting as essential features rather than failures of the system. When we deliberately suppress our dreams or restrict our sleep in ways that limit rapid eye movement cycles, our brains respond with an almost desperate surge of compensatory dreaming, a phenomenon known as REM Rebound Effect, which creates a paradoxical situation where our attempts to avoid dreams actually intensify them dramatically upon our next opportunity to sleep. This occurs because REM sleep, the stage in which most vivid dreaming takes place, is not merely a luxury of consciousness, but rather a fundamental biological need that our brain actively pursues and protects, much like how restricting water intake creates an overwhelming thirst that must eventually be satisfied. When people undergo sleep deprivation or use certain medications that suppress REM sleep, their brains keep track of the accumulated deficit, and when normal sleep finally resumes, the brain essentially hijacks the sleep cycle, forcing longer and more intense REM periods to make up for lost dream time, resulting in extraordinarily vivid, bizarre, and emotionally charged dreams that often feel more real than waking experience itself. The mechanism behind this rebound effect appears to involve the brainstem's regulation of neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and serotonin, which normally keep REM sleep in check during regular sleep cycles. But when these regulatory systems detect insufficient dream time, they flood the system during recovery sleep to maximize REM duration and intensity, essentially overcompensating for the deprivation. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating is how it reveals the brain's sophisticated self-regulation systems, yet we continue to normalize sleep disruption through modern work schedules, caffeine consumption, and screen usage, creating conditions where many people chronically experience partial REM deprivation followed by intense rebound dreams, only to suppress them again with the next cycle of sleep restriction. Trapping ourselves in a pattern where forgetting our dreams becomes not a natural occurrence, but rather a consequence of our perpetually disrupted relationship with sleep itself. When sleep becomes interrupted by frequent awakenings, microarousals, or periods of light sleep interspersed with deeper stages, the brain enters what researchers call a fragmented sleep state, and in these moments of disruption, dream recall becomes significantly compromised in ways that seem counterintuitive to our understanding of consciousness. During a night of fragmented sleep, a person may experience dozens of brief awakenings, some so subtle that conscious awareness never fully registers them. Yet the neurological impact on memory consolidation is profound and measurable, as the brain lacks the sustained periods of REM sleep necessary for dreams to be properly encoded into long-term memory, which means that even if vivid dreams occur throughout the night, they dissolve almost immediately upon waking, because the neural pathways required to transfer them from short-term dream consciousness into retrievable memory have been interrupted and weakened. The mechanism at work involves the brain's inability to maintain the specific neurochemical balance required during REM sleep, where dreams originate and where noradrenaline levels must remain low enough to allow dream content to be integrated with memory systems. But when fragmentation occurs, these chemical conditions never stabilize long enough for the necessary neurological processes to complete their work. This phenomenon persists as a largely unrecognized cause of dream forgetting despite its logical explanation, because fragmented sleep itself often goes undetected by sleepers, who may believe they slept well throughout the night, when in fact their sleep architecture was compromised by sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome, environmental disturbances, or anxiety, and thus they have no context to understand why their dream recall has diminished. Attributing the forgetting instead to other causes, while the actual culprit remains invisible and undiagnosed in their nightly rest patterns. Consider the person who wakes with a vivid dream still crystalline in their mind, the images and emotions so clear they could describe every detail, yet they remain in bed without reaching for pen or paper, without opening the notes application on their phone, without taking any action whatsoever to capture what they have just experienced. And within minutes the dream dissolves into the background haze of morning consciousness, becoming inaccessible no matter how hard they try to retrieve it later. This phenomenon of dream journaling absence represents a peculiar gap between intention and action, between the desire to remember and the willingness to document, and it occurs with such regularity that most people accept it as an inevitable aspect of sleep, rather than recognizing it as a deliberate choice they make repeatedly. The mechanism operating beneath this absence stems from several overlapping psychological factors that work together to discourage the simple act of recording dreams in the moments after waking. First, there exists a powerful inertia at the threshold of consciousness, where the brain remains in a transitional state, still partially engaged in the neurochemical patterns of sleep, making the prospect of physical action feel disproportionately demanding compared to simply lying still and allowing the body to gradually awaken. Second, there is a fundamental underestimation of how quickly dreams fade, a cognitive blind spot where people believe they will remember their nocturnal experiences throughout the day, only to discover hours later that the memories have vanished entirely, yet this repeated disappointment does not translate into changed behavior. Third, dream journaling requires an immediate commitment to a task that feels non-urgent and peripheral to the body's primary desire upon waking, which is typically comfort, continuation of rest, or the initiation of morning routines, all of which feel more pressing than documenting ephemeral mental imagery. As we advance through the decades of our lives, we often notice that the vivid dream narratives we once recalled with crystalline clarity upon waking have become increasingly elusive and fragmented, a phenomenon that appears with such regularity across aging populations that it has become almost universally accepted as an inevitable consequence of growing older. The younger mind, with its seemingly boundless capacity for retention and its rapid neural processing speeds, appears to capture and hold onto the surreal imagery and narrative threads of dreams with remarkable fidelity, allowing individuals in their teens and 20s to wake with elaborate dream sequences still dancing vividly in consciousness. Yet as the years accumulate and the brain undergoes the natural processes of aging, including the gradual decline in certain neurotransmitter production, the diminishment of hippocampal volume, and the general slowing of neural transmission speeds, the ability to encode these fleeting nighttime experiences into long-term memory appears to deteriorate in parallel. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon seems rooted in the changing neurochemistry of the aging brain, particularly the reduced production of acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter crucial for memory formation and the maintenance of attention during the rapid eye movement sleep stage, where most vivid dreaming occurs. Furthermore, the aging brain shows reduced connectivity between the regions responsible for memory consolidation and those responsible for dream generation, meaning that even when dreams are being actively experienced, the neural infrastructure required to transfer them into retrievable memory may be functioning less efficiently than it once did. What remains curious is how thoroughly this decline has been normalized within our cultural understanding of aging, treated not as a medical concern worthy of intervention or investigation, but rather as a simple and natural side effect of time's passage, much like the graying of hair or the stiffening of joints. When we consume alcohol before sleep, we often find that our dream recall becomes remarkably diminished or nearly non-existent by morning, leaving us with only fragmented impressions or complete blankness where vivid narratives might otherwise have unfolded. And this phenomenon represents one of the most direct and observable ways that chemical substances can interfere with our capacity to remember the nocturnal experiences that occur beneath their influence. The mechanism behind this effect operates through alcohol's profound impact on the brain's neurochemical balance, particularly its suppression of rapid eye movement sleep, or REM sleep, which is the stage during which the most vivid and memorable dreams occur. And when alcohol is present in our system, it disrupts the natural architecture of sleep by fragmenting REM periods and reducing their overall duration, making it mechanically impossible for dreams to develop with the narrative complexity and emotional intensity that would normally make them stick in our memory. Beyond this direct suppression of REM sleep, alcohol also impairs the hippocampus, the brain region responsible for consolidating new memories and transferring experiences from short-term into long-term storage, which means that even if dreams do occur during alcohol-influenced sleep, they never receive the biological signal to be properly encoded and retained, leaving them to dissolve like morning mist upon waking. Many of us take pharmaceutical medications as part of our daily routines, whether for managing chronic conditions, treating acute illnesses, or addressing mental health concerns, and we often notice that our dream recall seems to diminish or vanish entirely once we begin a new medication regimen. The medication interference theory posits that certain classes of drugs, particularly those affecting neurotransmitter systems in the brain, can substantially alter the neurochemical conditions necessary for dream formation, encoding, or the conscious recollection of dreams during waking hours. Medications such as antidepressants, antihistamines, benzodiazepines, and various blood pressure regulators all interact with the delicate balance of serotonin, dopamine, acetylcholine, and other crucial neurochemicals that appear to play significant roles in the REM sleep cycle where most vivid dreaming occurs. When these chemical balances shift due to pharmaceutical intervention, the brain's capacity to generate, maintain, or transfer dream memories into long-term storage can become compromised, leaving us with only a vague sense that something happened during sleep while the specific content remains inaccessible. The mechanism operates at a fundamental neurobiological level because dreams depend on particular patterns of neural activation and specific concentrations of neurotransmitters in brain regions like the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, structures essential for both memory formation and dream recall. When medications alter these precise chemical conditions, even slightly, the delicate process of consolidating dreams from ephemeral neural activity into retrievable memories can fail or become substantially weakened. We have largely normalized this effect without fully acknowledging its implications, treating dream loss as an acceptable side effect of necessary medical treatment, and rarely discussing with healthcare providers how specific medications might be affecting our sleep experience and consciousness. When the mind carries the weight of accumulated stress throughout the day, it enters a state of heightened cognitive load that fundamentally alters how memories are consolidated during sleep. The person who has spent their waking hours navigating deadlines, interpersonal conflicts, financial worries, or work-related pressure arrives at bedtime with their neurological resources already depleted, leaving little capacity for the delicate process of dream recall that requires sustained attention and mental energy. The stress hormones circulating through their system, particularly cortisol and adrenaline, create a neurochemical environment that prioritizes survival-oriented functions over the encoding of dream memories. As the brain in a stressed state naturally orients itself toward threat detection rather than the processing of abstract nocturnal imagery. During REM sleep, when most vivid dreams occur, the stressed individual's brain may actually spend more of its resources managing the emotional and physiological effects of their stress, rather than creating the robust neural pathways necessary to transfer dream content into waking memory. The forgetting becomes doubly reinforced because stress typically impairs sleep quality itself, reducing the amount of uninterrupted REM time available for dream formation, and simultaneously weakening the morning transition period when dreams are most easily recalled if one remains still and reflective rather than jolting awake into a state of worry and urgency. What persists despite this clear neurological explanation is our cultural normalization of stress as an unchangeable feature of modern life, leading us to accept the loss of our dream lives as simply another casualty of our demanding schedules, when in fact this forgetting represents a profound disconnection from our own inner world that might otherwise offer psychological insight and emotional relief during periods of high pressure and anxiety. Consider the person lying in bed at night, their mind still churning with the day's worries, replaying conversations and dwelling on uncertainties about tomorrow. When suddenly they recall a dream they had last night and begin to focus intently on reconstructing its details, turning the fragmented images over in their mind until, mysteriously, their anxious thoughts begin to fade and they drift towards sleep with surprising ease. This phenomenon reflects a neurological truth about how the human brain manages distress. When we engage our working memory and conscious attention with a sufficiently engaging but emotionally neutral task, we effectively create a cognitive barrier between ourselves and the sources of our anxiety, much like drawing a curtain between two rooms. The anxiety that was dominating our mental space does not disappear so much as it becomes temporarily inaccessible, pushed aside by the mental effort required to remember, visualize, and narrate dream sequences that are complex enough to demand focus but abstract enough to feel unthreatening. Our brains appear to instinctively recognize that certain memories and imaginative tasks occupy the same neural real estate as worry itself, and by consciously choosing to inhabit one mental space, we automatically exclude ourselves from the other. What is particularly striking about this mechanism is how thoroughly our minds have internalized this pattern without any explicit cultural instruction or psychological awareness. We simply discover through trial and error that thinking about dreams makes sleep easier when anxiety threatens, yet we rarely examine why this works or acknowledge that we are essentially using dream recall as an anxiety management technique. When sleep itself becomes fragmented and unreliable, when a person tosses through the night without achieving deep restorative cycles, the brain never enters the stages necessary for proper dream consolidation and memory encoding. And consequently, the dreams that do occur throughout these interrupted nights simply dissolve into the morning fog as though they never existed at all. A person experiencing poor sleep quality might wake multiple times throughout the night, their sleep architecture constantly interrupted by external noises, physical discomfort, racing thoughts, or underlying sleep disorders. And in these fragmented states, the brain lacks the sustained periods of REM sleep during which vivid dreams typically occur and integrate into memory. The mechanism here operates on a fundamental neurological level. Dreams require not just sleep, but quality sleep, the kind where the mind can cycle through its necessary stages uninterrupted, allowing for the neural consolidation that transforms fleeting dream imagery into something potentially memorable. Yet when sleep is poor and fractured, these cycles never complete properly, leaving the dreamer without the neurological foundation needed to recall anything upon waking. What persists beneath this reality is perhaps a cruel irony, that those who most desperately need the restorative and psychological benefits of dreams, those suffering through difficult nights and exhausted mornings, are precisely those least likely to remember what their minds produced during those restless hours. And we have largely normalized this phenomenon as simply an unfortunate consequence of modern life, rather than recognizing it as a feedback loop in which poor sleep begets forgotten dreams. Which then denies the sleeper one more potential source of comfort and self-understanding during an already difficult night. Consider the experience of waking from a dream that felt overwhelmingly real, saturated with color and sensation and emotional weight, only to find that within minutes the details have begun to dissolve like watercolor in rain, leaving behind only vague impressions and disconnected fragments that seem almost trivial in retrospect. Yet on other nights, you might experience dreams so hazy and insubstantial that you cannot quite grasp whether you dreamed at all, aware only of a general sense that your mind was active during sleep, without any concrete imagery to support that awareness. This variation in dream vividness appears to fluctuate unpredictably across nights and across individuals, creating a curious inconsistency in the texture and persistence of our nocturnal experiences that defies easy explanation or prediction. The psychological mechanism underlying this variation likely relates to the interplay between neurotransmitter levels, particularly acetylcholine, which facilitates the vivid hallucinatory qualities of REM sleep, and the degree to which our prefrontal cortex remains engaged or disengaged during dreaming cycles. When acetylcholine levels surge while norepinephrine and serotonin remain suppressed, dreams tend to achieve heightened vividness and emotional intensity. But this neurochemical choreography varies based on sleep stage duration, circadian rhythms, stress levels, and individual brain chemistry that we do not yet fully understand or predict with precision. Furthermore, the vividness we perceive upon waking may itself be shaped by our expectations and our attention during the transition between sleep and wakefulness, meaning that a dream's actual vividness during occurrence might differ substantially from the vividness we retrospectively assign to it based on what we can still remember. Consider the experience of jolting awake suddenly from sleep, perhaps due to an alarm, a noise, or an unexpected movement, when your consciousness transitions almost violently from the depths of slumber into full wakefulness within mere seconds. In these moments, there exists a peculiar phenomenon where the dreams that seemed so vivid, so real, so accessible just moments before the waking impulse dissolve almost instantaneously from memory, leaving behind only the faintest impression of having dreamed at all, though the specific content remains forever inaccessible. The abruptness of this transition appears to interrupt the natural cognitive processing that normally allows dreams to be consolidated into retrievable memories, as if the brain is caught mid-sentence in a conversation it cannot complete. When we wake gradually and naturally, our consciousness seems to gently surface from the dream state, allowing us a window of time to reflect upon and rehearse what we have experienced before the day's demands fully engage our attention. But when we wake too quickly, whether through external stimuli or internal physiological triggers, this critical transition period is essentially skipped, and the dream material lacks the necessary seconds or minutes of conscious reflection needed to cement it into memory. The mechanism behind this relates to how our brains encode experiences into lasting form, requiring a period of mental consolidation where recent memories are actively rehearsed and transferred from short-term to long-term storage. Dreams that are not consciously attended to and processed immediately upon waking simply never complete this transfer, remaining only in the temporary neurological patterns that dissolve within moments as new sensory information floods our awareness. Despite understanding this biological reality, we persist in expecting ourselves to remember our dreams even when we have subjected ourselves to sudden awakening, almost as if there exists a separate set of rules for dream recall that should exempt us from the natural consequences of our own sleep interruption patterns. Throughout a typical night of sleep, our brains experience fluctuating levels of REM activity, with density varying considerably across sleep cycles, and this variation in intensity and frequency of rapid eye movement periods may play a crucial role in determining which dreams we retain and which we allow to dissolve into complete obscurity upon waking. During the early cycles of sleep, REM periods tend to be shorter and less densely packed with neural activity, whereas as the night progresses and we approach morning hours, REM stages intensify dramatically, becoming denser and more cognitively elaborate, filled with increasingly complex dream narratives and vivid sensory experiences. The neurochemical environment during these denser REM periods differs significantly from lighter REM phases, with higher concentrations of certain neurotransmitters and increased activation across multiple brain regions simultaneously, creating what neuroscientists describe as a richer neurological landscape. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon suggests that dreams occurring during low-density REM periods may be encoded more weakly into memory because the neural firing patterns are less synchronized and less intensely engaged than during high-density periods, much like trying to record a photograph in dim light compared to bright sunlight. Conversely, the vivid, elaborate dreams that emerge during dense REM phases in the early morning hours benefit from this heightened neurological intensity, creating stronger memory traces that should theoretically be easier to recall after waking. Yet despite this logical expectation that we would remember these most intense, densest REM dreams most clearly, we often forget even these powerful nocturnal experiences within minutes of consciousness, suggesting that something beyond mere neurological intensity determines dream retention, and we have somehow normalized this paradox of forgetting our most vivid experiences as simply the nature of consciousness itself. Our capacity to retain and recall our dreams appears to be fundamentally shaped by personality traits, particularly the psychological dimension known as openness to experience, which describes how receptive we are to novel ideas, abstract thinking, creative pursuits, and internal emotional states. Individuals who score high in openness tend to be more curious about the nature of their own consciousness, more willing to explore the subjective realm of their imagination, and more inclined to engage in introspective practices that naturally cultivate dream recall, whereas those lower in openness may prioritize practical concerns and external stimuli, leaving their dream memories to fade as soon as consciousness begins to emerge. The mechanism underlying this distinction operates at the intersection of attention, motivation, and neural encoding, where people oriented toward openness naturally direct their cognitive resources toward capturing and preserving the fleeting imagery and narrative threads of their nocturnal experiences, while simultaneously maintaining a kind of mental posture that remains receptive to ambiguity and the non-rational content that dreams inherently contain. This tendency becomes self-reinforcing over time, as those who value and attend to their dreams develop stronger neural pathways associated with dream memory consolidation, much like exercising a muscle that grows stronger with use, while conversely, those who dismiss dreams as meaningless noise never develop this attentional capacity and therefore forget them with remarkable consistency. What persists as curious, however, is how this personality-based distinction in dream recall has become so naturalized in our culture that we rarely question whether forgetting dreams represents an inevitable neurological truth, or simply a reflection of our collective cultural orientation toward dismissing the internal landscape in favor of external productivity and measurable outcomes, leaving those of us with naturally lower openness unaware that our dream forgetfulness might itself be a learned behavior rather than an unchangeable fact of our neurobiology. There exists a curious observation among artists, writers, musicians, and other creative professionals. Those who report the highest levels of creative output and innovation often also report the poorest dream recall, as though their waking creative energies somehow demand a metabolic exchange for the dream memories that might otherwise linger in consciousness. The creativity correlation theory suggests that the brain's executive resources devoted to creative thinking during waking hours may fundamentally compete with the neural processes required to consolidate and retain dream narratives, creating an inverse relationship where imaginative capacity in daylight comes at the cost of nocturnal memory loss. When a person engages in intensive creative work, their brain maintains heightened activity in networks associated with divergent thinking, pattern recognition, and novel synthesis. And this sustained activation throughout the day may leave the hippocampus and related memory structures in a state of depletion or reduced sensitivity, making them less capable of encoding the spontaneous imagery generated during rapid eye movement sleep. Furthermore, highly creative individuals may possess neurological predispositions toward rapid idea generation and continuous mental elaboration, traits that persist even during sleep onset, creating a kind of cognitive momentum that actually interferes with the quiet, receptive mental state necessary for dream recall upon waking. The theory normalizes itself through cultural narratives celebrating the tortured artist and the restless genius, stories we tell ourselves about how true creativity demands sacrifice and sleeplessness, leading many creative people to interpret their dream amnesia not as a failure of memory, but as evidence of their own imaginative prowess, a badge worn with subtle pride rather than examined with scientific curiosity. Research across multiple sleep laboratories has consistently documented that women report remembering their dreams significantly more frequently than men do, a phenomenon that appears across cultures and age groups with remarkable consistency. When individuals of different genders are awakened during REM sleep and immediately asked to describe their dreams, women tend to provide longer, more detailed narratives with greater emotional content and narrative coherence, while men more often report either no dream recall whatsoever or fragmented, abstract descriptions lacking the structured storylines that women typically relate. This difference becomes even more pronounced when dream recall is measured over extended periods, with women maintaining dream journals that grow substantially thicker than those kept by men, suggesting either a genuine difference in dream vividness or a more developed capacity to retrieve and organize dream memories into language. The psychological explanation for this disparity likely involves multiple interconnected factors, beginning with hormonal influences where fluctuating estrogen and progesterone levels throughout the menstrual cycle may enhance memory consolidation during sleep stages, creating stronger neural pathways for dream integration into waking consciousness. Additionally, cognitive and social variables play significant roles, as women have been socialized to pay greater attention to emotional experiences and internal states, developing more sophisticated vocabulary for describing subjective mental phenomena, While cultural narratives often discourage men from focusing on or discussing dream content as valuable or worthy of attention. There exists also the possibility that differences in sleep architecture between genders, including variations in REM sleep duration and distribution, contribute to differential encoding opportunities. Across human civilization, different cultures have developed deeply rooted belief systems about the nature and purpose of dreams, systems that profoundly influence how people remember, interpret, and even forget their nocturnal visions upon waking. In many Western societies, dreams are often dismissed as mere neurological noise, random firing of the brain during sleep, a byproduct of memory consolidation that holds no inherent meaning or spiritual significance. And this cultural framework subtly discourages people from paying attention to their dreams or bothering to retain them in conscious memory. Conversely, in numerous indigenous cultures, African traditions, and Eastern philosophies, dreams are viewed as profound communications from ancestors, spiritual guides, or the subconscious mind itself, deserving of careful attention, journaling, and communal discussion, which naturally leads to better dream recall and retention because the cultural narrative emphasizes their importance. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through a process known as cultural priming, whereby the values and beliefs embedded in one's social environment directly shape which information the brain prioritizes for storage and retrieval, essentially training our neural pathways to remember or forget based on what our culture has taught us to value. When a child grows up hearing that dreams are meaningless, the brain gradually deprioritizes dream memory as unimportant information not worth encoding into long-term storage. Whereas a child raised in a culture that celebrates and interprets dreams experiences stronger neural encoding of these experiences because their brain recognizes them as culturally relevant and valuable. When we exist in a state of chronic sleep deprivation, our brains undergo a peculiar transformation in how they process and retain memories, particularly the ephemeral narratives of our dreams that typically dissolve upon waking. The sleep-deprived mind operates at a fundamental disadvantage when it comes to consolidating dream memories into accessible neural pathways, because the mechanisms responsible for transferring information from short-term hippocampal storage into long-term cortical networks require sufficient sleep cycles to function optimally. During deep sleep and REM sleep stages, the brain engages in what neuroscientists call systems consolidation, wherein the prefrontal cortex actively reviews and integrates the emotionally vivid experiences that occurred during earlier dream phases. Yet this intricate process simply cannot occur with adequate efficiency when total sleep time remains critically reduced. The exhausted brain essentially lacks the neurochemical resources and the available neural real estate to perform this consolidation work, leaving dreams to vanish almost immediately upon the moment of waking, creating a strange paradox where the very condition that might theoretically give us more time awake to remember our dreams instead ensures that we retain virtually nothing of them. This phenomenon persists across populations with surprising consistency, affecting students cramming before examinations, shift workers maintaining irregular schedules, and parents of newborns operating on fragmented sleep schedules, all reporting dramatically reduced dream recall even when they manage to achieve some amount of sleep between their fragmented periods of wakefulness. Consider the experience of waking in the morning with only scattered impressions of the night before, a glimpse of a face that dissolves before you can identify it, a sensation of movement through a space that feels familiar yet impossible, a conversation conducted in a language that made perfect sense while dreaming but now resists translation into waking thought. These fragments do not arrange themselves into coherent stories, and yet we often find ourselves attempting to stitch them together retroactively, as though the dream possessed a narrative arc that we simply failed to capture completely. The mind, it seems, does not store dreams as the brain stores waking memories, with a clear beginning, middle, and end, but rather as a collection of disconnected sensory and emotional impressions that our conscious mind struggles to organize into something recognizable as narrative. The brain during REM sleep operates differently from the waking brain, with the prefrontal cortex, responsible for logical sequencing and narrative construction, showing significantly reduced activity while the limbic system and visual cortex remain highly active, creating experiences that are vivid and emotionally charged but lack the organizational scaffolding that would render them memorable upon waking. This fundamental mismatch between how dreams are generated and how our waking mind is structured to encode and retrieve memories means that by the time we attempt to recall a dream, we are essentially trying to impose narrative order onto something that was never constructed as narrative in the first place. We have normalized this experience of fragmentation so completely that we rarely question why dreams should be any different from other memories, why they should slip away like water through our fingers while other experiences remain intact. Consider the peculiar phenomenon wherein our minds seem to operate according to an invisible censorship board as we drift toward sleep, selectively preserving certain dream narratives while systematically erasing others from conscious memory before we even fully awaken. We find ourselves remembering the mundane details of a conversation with a coworker from 3 weeks ago with crystalline clarity, yet the elaborate dream sequence we experienced just moments ago dissolves like watercolor in rain the instant our eyes open. The theory of bizarre content filtering suggests that our brains engage in a form of active discrimination during the transition between sleep and wakefulness, determining which dreams are palatable enough, coherent enough, or sufficiently aligned with our waking identity to warrant encoding into long-term memory. Perhaps our unconscious mind operates like an editorial department, reviewing the chaotic narratives generated during REM sleep and making split-second decisions about which storylines threaten our sense of self, which contain emotionally destabilizing material, and which are simply too nonsensical to be worth the neural storage space. The mechanism may involve the prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and self-awareness, gradually reasserting control as we wake, and in doing so, retroactively filtering which dream content gets flagged for retention based on criteria we cannot consciously articulate. What makes this theory particularly compelling is how it explains why traumatic dreams often persist vividly while pleasant, but ordinary ones vanish immediately, suggesting that emotional intensity itself may trigger selective preservation. We have come to accept this selective forgetting as natural and inevitable, yet it remains fundamentally strange that we lose the majority of our nocturnal experiences while our brains simultaneously retain irrelevant details from daily life, as if the filtering system has become so normalized within human consciousness that we rarely question its arbitrary and contradictory nature. Consider the moment you wake from a dream that felt overwhelmingly vivid, saturated with emotional weight, perhaps filled with terror or profound sadness or inexplicable joy. And yet within minutes of opening your eyes and beginning your day, that emotional resonance simply evaporates like morning mist under sunlight. The dream itself might linger in fragmented images or vague narrative threads, but the feeling that made it matter, the visceral intensity that gripped you in sleep, dissolves into an abstract memory of having felt something significant without actually feeling it anymore. This phenomenon occurs because emotions experienced during dreams are generated by neurochemical processes unique to the sleeping brain, particularly heightened activity in the amygdala and limbic system, while the prefrontal cortex remains relatively quiet. And when consciousness shifts back to waking awareness, these neurochemical conditions simply cease to replicate. The emotional tags that were attached to dream imagery during sleep were never meant to persist into wakefulness because they served no evolutionary purpose beyond the dream itself. And your brain, in its efficiency, does not maintain those chemical signatures once their context has expired. What makes this particularly curious is how we have normalized this loss despite it being, by any logical measure, a form of forgetting that removes the most essential component of an experience, leaving only the skeleton of narrative behind. We rarely question why a dream that left us trembling with fear at 3 in the morning becomes a mildly interesting anecdote by breakfast time, and perhaps this acceptance itself facilitates the process, as our lack of resistance to the fading intensity actually allows the neurochemical shift to proceed unimpeded, our conscious expectation that dreams will lose their emotional weight becoming a self-fulfilling mechanism that hastens their dissolution. Consider the remarkable phenomenon wherein the brain becomes so accustomed to the regular occurrence of dreams that it begins to treat them as background noise, filtering them out from conscious memory almost as soon as they occur, much like how commuters stop hearing the rumble of passing trains or how office workers cease to notice the hum of fluorescent lights after weeks of exposure. This process, known as habituation, represents one of the mind's most efficient survival mechanisms, a neurological shortcut that allows conscious awareness to conserve energy by dismissing stimuli that pose no immediate threat or relevance to waking life. When dreams recur night after night with their strange narratives and illogical progressions, the brain's novelty detection systems gradually downregulate their response, treating the dream experience not as something worthy of attention or memory consolidation, but rather as neural static that requires no encoding into long-term storage. The psychological mechanism underlying this adaptation stems from the brain's fundamental need to distinguish between meaningful and meaningless information. And since dreams typically carry no survival value and bear no logical connection to daily functioning, the mind has evolved to dismiss them as background processing activity rather than important experiences deserving preservation. What makes this habituation particularly persistent despite its apparent illogic is that humans have normalized the act of forgetting dreams as simply part of the natural sleep cycle, rarely questioning why we would design a system that generates 8 hours of sensory experience only to discard all record of it, treating dream amnesia not as a strange cognitive failure, but instead as an expected and unremarkable aspect of consciousness that requires no explanation or concern. A quiet acceptance that has become so deeply embedded in human culture and neurobiology that we scarcely notice the profound peculiarity of spending a third of our lives in vivid, immersive experiences that vanish without trace. There exists a peculiar phenomenon among those who have developed the ability to recognize they are dreaming while the dream unfolds, a state known as lucid dreaming, wherein the normal forgetting mechanism seems to operate in reverse or perhaps fails to engage at all. These individuals report with remarkable consistency that their lucid dreams remain vivid and retrievable long after waking, often with far greater detail and clarity than their non-lucid counterparts, suggesting that the very act of conscious awareness within the dream state somehow immunizes the experience against the standard neural processes that dissolve most dream memories within minutes of awakening. The psychological explanation appears to center on the involvement of metacognition, that distinctly human capacity to think about one's own thinking, which activates additional neural regions during the dream state, particularly those associated with self-reflection and working memory, thereby creating multiple encoding pathways that reinforce the dream content rather than allowing it to dissipate into the neurochemical void. When a dreamer becomes aware that they are dreaming and sustains that awareness throughout the experience, they are essentially applying waking state memory consolidation strategies to sleeping state consciousness, bootstrapping the dream into a different category of mental event, one that the brain treats with the same urgency as real experiences worth preserving. What remains curious and somewhat paradoxical is that this exception does not fundamentally undermine the broader theory that we forget dreams to facilitate sleep, because lucid dreamers often report that maintaining lucidity requires considerable cognitive effort and can actually disrupt the quality of sleep itself, as though the brain is willing to sacrifice some sleep integrity to preserve conscious experience and memory. As evening approaches and darkness settles across the landscape, your brain initiates a carefully orchestrated chemical symphony that has remained largely unchanged for millions of years, beginning with the production and release of melatonin from the pineal gland, a small endocrine structure nestled deep within the brain that serves as your body's primary timekeeper. This hormone gradually accumulates throughout the evening hours, signaling to every cell in your body that sleep is approaching, creating a cascade of physiological changes that prepare you for rest, including lowered body temperature, reduced alertness, and a general dimming of consciousness that makes the world feel softer and less demanding. However, as you drift towards sleep and enter the deeper stages of the sleep cycle, melatonin levels begin to fluctuate in patterns that correlate directly with different phases of REM sleep and non-REM sleep. And this biochemical shifting may actively suppress the neural mechanisms required for dream recall and memory consolidation of those dreams into long-term storage. The dreams you experience during REM sleep occur precisely when melatonin levels are in certain phases of their cyclical pattern, and the very neurochemical environment that the melatonin helps create may actually interfere with the brain's ability to tag those experiences as important enough to remember, essentially prioritizing the sleep-inducing effects of the hormone over the preservation of dream narratives. This mechanism appears to serve an evolutionary purpose, as forgetting dreams upon waking would have allowed our ancestors to focus immediately on survival tasks and present threats, rather than being distracted by the bizarre narratives of sleep. And in this way, the melatonin cycle became intertwined with the forgetting process itself. As the body prepares for sleep, it undergoes a careful orchestration of physiological changes, one of the most significant being a gradual reduction in core temperature, a process that typically begins in the late afternoon and continues through the evening hours until sleep arrives. During this cooling phase, the mind may become increasingly active, processing accumulated sensory information and emotional experiences from the day. And one hypothesis suggests that dreams themselves represent a kind of mental noise that the brain must consciously forget in order to allow the deeper thermoregulatory mechanisms to take full effect without distraction. The theory proposes that when we lie down in a darkened room and begin to cool, our conscious attention to vivid dream imagery would actually work against the body's temperature-shedding goals, as maintaining detailed mental narratives and emotional engagement requires metabolic energy and elevated brain activity that would counteract the cooling process. Therefore, according to this framework, the brain may have developed a mechanism to actively suppress dream recall as we transition through different sleep stages, effectively erasing the memory of these experiences to eliminate any mental resistance to the physical shutdown required for genuine rest. The logic appears sound on the surface. The more cognitively engaged we remain with dream content, the less efficiently our body can redistribute blood flow to peripheral tissues and trigger the sweating and heat dissipation necessary for that crucial temperature drop. And yet, despite decades of sleep research demonstrating that dreams occur throughout all sleep stages regardless of temperature, and that temperature regulation happens largely independent of conscious awareness or dream recall, many people continue to experience forgotten dreams as a natural and necessary part of their bedtime routine, as though the body's quiet wisdom knows something that scientific instruments have not yet fully measured or understood. Throughout the day, your brain operates at different frequencies, moving between beta waves during active thought and engagement, alpha waves during relaxation, and theta waves during deep meditation and the early stages of sleep. And as you prepare for bed and begin to drift toward unconsciousness, your brain naturally transitions through these frequency ranges in a process that is both physiological and deeply connected to memory consolidation and retention. The theory of brain wave frequency shifts suggests that dreams may be forgotten precisely because of the dramatic oscillations that occur when your consciousness shifts from the complex high-frequency electrical activity associated with waking thought to the slower, more rhythmic patterns characteristic of sleep stages. And this transition essentially creates an incompatibility between the neurological state that generates dreams and the neurological state required to encode them into long-term memory. During REM sleep, when most vivid dreaming occurs, your brain produces a chaotic mix of theta and beta waves, a pattern sometimes called paradoxical sleep because it resembles waking brain activity despite your being fully asleep. Yet this very chaos may work against memory formation by preventing the stable, synchronized neural firing patterns necessary for consolidation. When you then awaken and your brain rapidly shifts back toward beta wave dominance, the abrupt frequency change essentially disrupts any fragile dream memories that had begun forming, like tuning a radio dial away from a station before the broadcast can be properly recorded. This explanation accounts for the common experience of waking with only vague impressions of dreams that felt vivid mere seconds before consciousness fully returned, as if the neurological shift itself erases the content. As we descend into the deeper stages of sleep each night, our brain undergoes a profound shift in its electrical activity, entering what sleep scientists call slow-wave sleep, a phase characterized by the lowest frequency brain waves our minds produce during the entire sleep cycle. During these deepest stages of non-REM sleep, typically occurring in the first half of the night when our bodies are most thoroughly exhausted and our neurological systems are focused on physical restoration rather than cognitive processing, the brain appears to actively suppress the mechanisms necessary for dream formation and dream recall. The slow waves that dominate this sleep stage, rolling across the cortex in synchronized patterns, seem to create an environment fundamentally incompatible with the kind of neural activation that produces vivid, memorable dreams. This dominance of slow-wave sleep, which can last for extended periods during the early night hours, coincides precisely with our most profound amnesia regarding dream content, as if the very physics of these low-frequency brain waves somehow erases or prevents the encoding of dream narratives into memory. The mechanism appears to involve the disruption of the neural pathways between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, the very connections that typically allow us to translate emotional experiences into narrative memories, meaning that even if dreams are occurring during slow-wave sleep, the biological infrastructure needed to remember them remains largely offline. We have become so accustomed to this natural phenomenon that we treat it as inevitable, rarely questioning why the deepest, most restorative phases of sleep should be precisely those phases where our consciousness leaves no trace, where hours pass in complete neurological darkness from which we emerge with no recollection. And this normalization persists despite the fact that it seems counterintuitive that our brain would actively erase experiences simply because it is working most intensely on physical recovery and maintenance. Consider the peculiar phenomenon of waking from what feels like a completely thoughtless sleep, a span of several hours during which your mind appears to have been entirely blank, devoid of imagery or narrative, yet you awaken feeling as though you have indeed slept profoundly and recovered from your waking fatigue. This experience dominates the majority of our sleep architecture, as non-rapid eye movement sleep, or non-REM sleep, constitutes approximately 75% of our total sleep duration across the night, moving through its three distinct stages from light sleep into deep, restorative slow-wave sleep. During these extended periods, particularly in the deepest stages where delta waves dominate the brain's electrical activity, we appear to generate far fewer dreams than we do during REM sleep, and the dreams we do produce tend to be fragmented, abstract, and utterly resistant to memory formation once we awaken. The mechanism underlying this forgetting appears rooted in neurochemistry itself, as the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, which is crucial for memory consolidation and the encoding of new information into long-term storage, remains at its lowest concentrations during non-REM sleep, specifically during slow-wave sleep, where the brain's metabolic activity shifts toward restoration rather than narrative construction. Without this chemical messenger actively facilitating the transfer of information from short-term to long-term memory systems, the fleeting mental activity that does occur during non-REM stages simply evaporates upon awakening, leaving no trace in our conscious recollection. Yet what strikes us most profoundly is how completely we have accepted this forgetting as natural and inevitable, how we never question the strangeness of losing hours of our existence to an apparent mental void, how we have normalized the idea that only the dreams of REM sleep deserve to be remembered, as though non-REM sleep were somehow less deserving of our cognitive attention or less worthy of preservation in memory. Throughout medical history, pharmaceutical interventions have been developed and prescribed to address the perceived problem of excessive dreaming or vivid nightmares that disrupt sleep quality, leading some researchers and clinicians to explore compounds that might suppress dream activity altogether. And while the efficacy and ethics of such medications remain deeply contested within the scientific community, the reality is that certain classes of drugs, particularly some antidepressants and antipsychotics, do demonstrably reduce REM sleep and consequently diminish dream recall in patients who take them regularly. The mechanism behind this phenomenon operates on a neurochemical level, as these medications alter the balance of neurotransmitters like serotonin and norepinephrine in the brain, which in turn affects the neural circuits responsible for generating the rapid eye movement sleep stage, where most vivid dreaming occurs, and by essentially dampening the brain's ability to enter or maintain REM sleep. These drugs create an indirect dream suppression effect that some patients report as beneficial when their dreams have become intrusive or disturbing. Consider the afternoon when you've consumed your final cup of coffee or tea, and as the evening approaches, your body enters a peculiar state of biochemical transition where the stimulant that has been coursing through your system begins to metabolize and dissipate. During this withdrawal period, your nervous system experiences a rebound effect as adenosine receptors that were previously blocked by caffeine molecules suddenly become available again, flooding your awareness with a sensation of fatigue that feels almost overwhelming in its intensity. This accumulated tiredness, which has been masked throughout the day by the stimulant's persistent presence, crashes down upon you with surprising force, creating a paradoxical scenario where you feel simultaneously exhausted and restless, a combination that researchers have found can actually disrupt the normal progression into sleep. The mechanism operates through a deceptively simple process. Caffeine blocks adenosine, a neurotransmitter responsible for sleep pressure, but once the caffeine clears from your system, adenosine floods back with vengeance, sometimes overshooting the equilibrium your brain normally maintains. This rebound effect can trigger a kind of neurological noise or static that interferes with the delicate process of transitioning into sleep. And paradoxically, the very thing that should put you to sleep by making you tired, instead, keeps you suspended in an uncomfortable liminal state where sleep eludes you despite profound exhaustion. We have largely normalized and accepted this phenomenon without question, treating it as simply part of the cost of consuming stimulants, rarely stopping to consider how our daily caffeine habits may be rewiring our sleep architecture and dream recall in subtle but persistent ways that accumulate across months and years. The alarm sounds, and in that first moment of consciousness, fragments of dreams still cling to the edges of awareness like morning mist over water, vivid and present and entirely real. But then the cascade begins. The shower runs, steam fills the bathroom, and the mind shifts its focus to the temperature of the water, the sensation of soap, the decision of which shampoo to use. The dream fades. By the time you're drying off, you cannot quite remember what you were doing in that strange landscape, who was standing beside you, or why the sky was the color it was. The coffee maker gurgles as it brews, and now your attention diverts to the aroma, the anticipation of caffeine, the calculation of whether you have time to drink it before leaving. The dream is nearly gone. You brush your teeth, you check your phone, you scroll through messages and notifications and headlines that demand your cognitive resources. You select your clothes, you tie your shoes, you gather your keys and your wallet and your bag, each small task a tiny demand on the limited space of short-term memory. The dream is gone completely. This process reveals something fundamental about how human consciousness operates. The brain does not maintain multiple parallel streams of attention simultaneously with equal intensity. Instead, it allocates resources to whatever demands the most immediate interaction with the physical environment. Dreams exist in a delicate neurological state that requires a certain kind of gentle holding, a deliberate preservation of that dream logic space. The moment external stimuli begin competing for attention, the neural patterns that encoded the dream experience are overwritten by more pressing concerns. The morning routine is precisely engineered, by its very nature, to demand this kind of sequential attention. Shower, breakfast, grooming, dressing, commuting, each step a small ritual that pulls the mind forward into the day ahead and deeper into the practical concerns of the waking world. We have normalized this transition so completely that we rarely question it. Consider the modern bedroom, a space that has undergone a remarkable transformation over the past century, evolving from a naturally lit chamber dependent entirely on the sun's rhythms to an environment saturated with artificial light sources that compete relentlessly with our body's most fundamental biological clock. When we attempt to fall asleep, we often find ourselves surrounded by the soft glow of bedside lamps, the faint illumination from electronic devices, the standby lights on televisions and charging cables, and the ambient light filtering through windows from streetlights and neighboring buildings, and this persistent exposure to light, particularly the blue wavelengths that our bodies interpret as indicators of daytime, fundamentally disrupts the production of melatonin, the hormone that signals to our brain that sleep should commence. The mechanism underlying this disruption is ancient and elegant in its design. Our circadian rhythm evolved over millions of years in a world where darkness meant sleep and light meant wakefulness, and our ancestors' pineal glands produced melatonin reliably because the absence of light was absolute and consistent. Yet now our modern existence has shattered this simplicity by introducing an almost perpetual twilight into our sleeping spaces. When light reaches our eyes, even in amounts we barely consciously register, specialized photoreceptors called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells send signals to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the brain's master clock, which then suppresses melatonin production and maintains us in a state of alertness. And paradoxically, this physiological arousal caused by light exposure makes it increasingly difficult to remember and retain our dreams, because the brain never fully enters the deep stages of sleep, where dream consolidation most readily occurs. In the hours before sleep, millions of people reach for their phones, tablets, and laptops, illuminating their faces with the glow of screens in darkened bedrooms, scrolling through social media feeds, checking emails, watching videos, and consuming endless streams of content right up until the moment they close their eyes and attempt to rest. This has become such a normalized part of our evening routine that we rarely question whether the habit itself might be interfering with the very thing we are trying to accomplish, which is the ability to fall asleep and retain our dreams throughout the night. The blue light emitted from these devices suppresses the production of melatonin, the hormone responsible for regulating our circadian rhythms and signaling to our brain that it is time to transition into sleep. Yet we continue the practice anyway, seemingly unable to disconnect even as we prepare for disconnection in the form of unconsciousness. Beyond the physiological disruption, screen time before bed creates a state of mental stimulation at precisely the moment when our minds should be winding down and becoming quieter. As the content we consume triggers emotional responses, activates reward pathways in the brain through likes and notifications, and keeps our thoughts racing with information and concerns, rather than allowing them to settle into the slow, drifting state necessary for deep sleep and vivid dream recall. The psychological mechanism at work here involves both addiction and anxiety, because the devices we hold provide constant access to connection, validation, and distraction from the uncertainties of our lives, making them difficult to relinquish even when we intellectually understand that doing so would improve our sleep quality and our ability to remember what we dream. Sleep apnea represents one of the most disruptive yet often undiagnosed conditions affecting the architecture of human sleep, and its relationship to dream recall presents a fascinating intersection between physiology and consciousness that has only recently begun to receive adequate scientific attention. When a person experiences sleep apnea, particularly obstructive sleep apnea, their breathing repeatedly stops and starts throughout the night, causing microarousals that fragment sleep into countless brief interruptions, each one jarring the sleeper partially toward wakefulness without achieving full consciousness. And these recurring disruptions fundamentally alter the normal progression through sleep cycles that would otherwise allow for extended periods of REM sleep during which most vivid dreaming occurs. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon is rooted in the basic neurobiology of sleep architecture itself, for dreams are most likely to be remembered when a person awakens directly from REM sleep or shortly after, when the brain chemicals responsible for memory consolidation are still active and the experience remains fresh in neural networks. Yet when sleep apnea causes constant fragmentation, the brain's ability to complete full REM cycles becomes severely compromised. Meaning that even when dreams do occur, the person's consciousness never settles long enough in the post-dream state to encode those experiences into waking memory. Furthermore, the chronic sleep deprivation that results from apneic episodes leaves the brain in a state of perpetual exhaustion, which paradoxically impairs the very cognitive functions needed to recognize and retain dreams upon waking, creating a double injury wherein both the opportunity to dream fully and the capacity to remember dreams are simultaneously undermined. When someone suffers from chronic insomnia, their relationship with sleep becomes fundamentally altered, and this altered state can paradoxically influence the very mechanisms that govern dream recall and memory consolidation during sleep. A person with chronic insomnia experiences night after night of fragmented sleep, reduced REM cycles, and interrupted sleep architecture, which means their brain spends less time in the stages where vivid dreams occur and where dream content is typically transferred into memory. The irony lies in the fact that while one might assume chronic insomniacs would remember more dreams due to frequent awakenings, the opposite often occurs because these interrupted awakenings do not align with natural REM sleep endings, and the brain's neurochemical state during insomnia is fundamentally different from normal sleep, making it harder to encode dream experiences into long-term memory. The person lies awake in darkness, their mind cycling through anxiety about sleep itself, worry about tomorrow, regrets about today, and the meta-anxiety of wondering why they cannot sleep, which creates a state of hyperarousal that persists even when sleep finally does arrive in fragmented bursts. This chronic hyperarousal means the brain never fully disconnects from its waking vigilance system, and dreams require a specific neurochemical environment to form vivid, memorable experiences, an environment that simply does not exist when someone's neural systems remain partially activated throughout the night. Over time, chronic insomniacs report that their dreams become increasingly vague, forgettable, or almost non-existent in their recall, not because they are not dreaming, but because the conditions under which dreams become memorable are absent. And somehow society has come to accept this as merely another symptom of insomnia, rather than recognizing it as part of a deeper disruption of the brain's fundamental processes of memory, consciousness, and the mysterious functions that dreams serve in maintaining psychological health. Most people wake up from sleep with no memory of the dreams they experienced during the night, and they accept this as a natural, unchangeable fact of human existence. Yet what they do not realize is that dream recall operates much like any other cognitive skill and can be systematically improved through consistent practice and intentional training methods. The absence of dedicated dream recall training in our daily lives means that we never develop the neural pathways and attentional strategies necessary to capture, encode, and retain the vivid narratives that unfold during our sleep cycles. And without this practice skill, our dreams simply dissolve into the neurological void like chalk drawings washed away by rain. When we drift into sleep each night, our brains produce elaborate sequences of imagery and experience. Yet unless we have trained ourselves to immediately recognize these dreams upon waking and to deliberately focus our attention on remembering them, they fade within moments as our waking consciousness takes over and redirects our neural resources toward the practical concerns of daily life. The psychological mechanism behind this phenomenon involves the transition between different brain states and neurotransmitter profiles, where the chemicals that support vivid dream formation during REM sleep are rapidly depleted and replaced by the neurochemicals that support logical waking thought. And in this transition window, our dreams become inaccessible to memory unless we have practiced techniques to bridge this neurological gap. People who do engage in dream recall training, such as maintaining a dream journal immediately upon waking, setting intention before sleep, or practicing meditation and mindfulness techniques, consistently report dramatic improvements in their dream memory. Yet most of us never attempt these practices because we have internalized the belief that forgetting dreams is inevitable and universal. Consider the peculiar experience of lying in bed at night, your mind racing with fragments of the day's events, unfinished conversations, and scattered thoughts that seem to pull your attention in a dozen different directions simultaneously. Yet the moment you attempt to recall a dream from the night before, that entire narrative landscape vanishes as though it never existed at all. The attention deficit theory proposes that our dreams fade from memory not because they are inherently forgettable, but because the neurological systems responsible for maintaining focused attention during waking hours operate under fundamentally different principles than those governing the dream state itself. When we transition from sleep to wakefulness, our brain must rapidly reallocate its attentional resources from the diffuse, nonlinear processing of dreams toward the concentrated, goal-directed focus required for conscious thought and action in the world. This sudden shift in attentional architecture may function as a kind of cognitive reset, where the brain essentially abandons the dream narrative in favor of prioritizing immediate environmental awareness and practical concerns. The mechanism operates somewhat like a spotlight that must instantly redirect from one stage to another, leaving the previously illuminated area in darkness. Furthermore, dreams themselves are characterized by what neuroscientists describe as a state of reduced directed attention, wherein the prefrontal cortex, which governs executive function and sustained focus, remains relatively inactive during rapid eye movement sleep. This means that dreams are encoded in a brain state fundamentally incompatible with the attentional mechanisms necessary to consciously retrieve and maintain them. What makes this theory particularly compelling is how it reflects a broader pattern in human cognition, wherein we have become increasingly adapted to maintaining sharp, narrow attention at the expense of peripheral awareness and diffuse processing. There exists a peculiar paradox at the intersection of meditation practice and dream memory, wherein the very act of cultivating mental stillness and present moment awareness seems to simultaneously enhance our ability to retain and recall the ephemeral narratives that unfold during sleep. Yet we rarely attribute our dream retention to this practice despite mounting evidence of its efficacy. When individuals establish consistent meditation routines, particularly those involving mindfulness or body scanning techniques performed before sleep, they often report a marked increase in dream recall vividness and frequency, noticing intricate details they previously overlooked or forgotten entirely, discovering landscapes and conversations they would have dismissed upon waking. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through several interconnected neurological pathways. Meditation strengthens the connection between the prefrontal cortex, which governs memory encoding and retrieval, and the areas of the brain responsible for processing rapid eye movement sleep, where most vivid dreaming occurs, thereby creating a more robust neural infrastructure for capturing and storing dream content before it dissolves into the fog of morning consciousness. Additionally, the deliberate cultivation of mental clarity and sustained attention through meditation trains the mind to hold onto fleeting thoughts and sensations with greater tenacity, transforming our relationship with the transient and ephemeral into one of sustained observation rather than passive acceptance of forgetting. Yet despite this demonstrable connection, meditation remains curiously absent from popular discussions about dream retention, relegated instead to vague spiritual frameworks or wellness trends rather than recognized as a cognitive tool with measurable effects on memory formation and dream preservation. Suggesting that we have somehow normalized the idea of meditation as inherently mysterious or spiritually oriented, rather than acknowledging its practical neurological consequences on the waking mind's ability to grasp what the sleeping mind has created. There exists a peculiar phenomenon in the relationship between childhood and dream memory, where the vividness and frequency with which we recall our dreams seems to shift dramatically as we age, and this transformation begins not in adulthood, but in the very years when our dream life should theoretically be richest and most accessible. Children frequently report their dreams with remarkable detail and enthusiasm, describing elaborate narratives filled with color, emotion, and sensory richness. Yet as those same individuals progress through adolescence and into their adult years, this natural facility for dream recall appears to diminish significantly, and the dreams that once filled bedtime conversations gradually fade into the murky territory of forgotten night visions. The mechanism underlying this change appears to involve the developing brain's increasing specialization and cognitive reorganization, where childhood consciousness operates in a more fluid state between waking and sleeping, allowing dream content to transfer more readily into conscious memory before the rigid structures of adult thinking solidify those neural pathways. As children mature, their brains develop stronger categorical thinking, more defined boundaries between different states of consciousness, and increasingly sophisticated executive functions that paradoxically make the dreamscape seem more alien and inaccessible by comparison to the concrete, rule-governed waking world. What makes this particularly notable is that we have largely accepted this decline in dream recall as inevitable and entirely natural, rarely questioning whether the loss of dream memory represents genuine neurological necessity or simply a cultural shift toward valuing rational, waking consciousness above all else. And yet children in different cultural contexts, where dream discussion and interpretation remain integrated into daily life and spiritual practice, maintain their dream recall abilities well into adulthood, suggesting that the forgetting is not purely biological, but deeply shaped by which memories we are encouraged to preserve and which we implicitly learn to abandon. Consider the possibility that our capacity to forget dreams upon waking exists not as a universal human experience, but rather as something written into the very fabric of our individual genetics, passed down through generations like eye color or predisposition to certain illnesses. Some people wake with vivid, crystalline memories of their nighttime journeys, entire narratives intact and accessible for hours, while others surface from sleep into a void, grasping at wisps of sensation that dissolve the moment conscious thought takes hold. The genetic predisposition theory suggests that this variation in dream recall ability is largely determined by inherited traits that influence how our brains consolidate memories during sleep, how our neurotransmitter systems function, and how efficiently the bridge between REM sleep consciousness and waking consciousness maintains its integrity. Perhaps certain families carry genetic markers that predispose them toward enhanced dream recall, while others inherit a biological tendency toward rapid forgetting, a kind of built-in amnesia that may have served evolutionary purposes we can no longer fully comprehend. Those who forget dreams easily might possess variations in their COMT genes or other regulatory sequences that affect dopamine and acetylcholine balance, neurochemicals central to memory formation and dream vividness. This theory acknowledges that while environmental factors, sleep quality, and conscious intention all influence dream retention, there exists an underlying genetic foundation that establishes baseline parameters for each individual's natural dream memory capacity. Over generations, we have largely accepted our personal dream retention patterns as fixed characteristics rather than fighting against them, normalizing the experience that some of us are simply not dream people, or conversely, that we are naturally vivid dreamers, as though this represents an immutable aspect of our biological identity, much like height or metabolism. The brain operates as an intricate chemical symphony, with neurotransmitters acting as the messengers that facilitate communication between neurons. And when these chemical messengers fall out of balance during the sleep cycle, our capacity to retain and recall dream memories becomes fundamentally compromised in ways we rarely understand or acknowledge. During REM sleep, when most vivid dreams occur, the brain experiences significant fluctuations in neurotransmitter levels, particularly involving serotonin, norepinephrine, and acetylcholine, and it is precisely this chemical instability that may prevent the neural pathways responsible for memory consolidation from functioning optimally, thus allowing dream content to slip away from conscious recall even as the dream itself unfolds vividly in the sleeping mind. The mechanism operates through a specific neurochemical process wherein the pontine tegmentum, a region deep within the brainstem, generates the electrical activity that triggers REM sleep and dreams, while simultaneously suppressing the release of norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter essential for attention and memory encoding, which means that even though the dream experience may be extraordinarily detailed and emotionally intense, the chemical environment necessary to transfer that experience into retrievable memory simply does not exist at that moment. Additionally, serotonin levels plummet during REM sleep, and serotonin plays a crucial role in memory formation and emotional processing. So the neurochemical conditions that allow dreams to occur are almost inversely proportional to the neurochemical conditions that allow us to remember them, creating a paradoxical situation where our most mentally active sleep phase is also the phase where we are chemically least equipped to retain what we experience. The human sleep cycle operates in 90-minute intervals, a biological rhythm that structures our entire night into distinct phases of light sleep, deep sleep, and rapid eye movement sleep. And it is precisely this architectural blueprint of our nocturnal existence that may hold profound implications for why we fail to retain our dreams upon waking. When we complete a full cycle and transition from one phase into the next, our brain undergoes a remarkable neurochemical shift that essentially wipes the slate clean, resetting the conditions under which memory consolidation occurs. And if we happen to wake during this transitional moment rather than in the middle of a dream sequence, we surface into consciousness with no vivid narrative to grasp or remember. The theory suggests that our dream recall depends heavily on where we land in this cyclical journey, because the longer we remain asleep and the more cycles we complete, the greater the likelihood that we will wake at a juncture where the dream has already dissolved from accessible memory, having been pushed back into the deeper recesses of our neural architecture where active retrieval becomes nearly impossible. This mechanism is not a flaw, but rather an elegant design, as the cyclical structure ensures that most of our sleep time is devoted to genuine restoration rather than to the conscious experience or retention of dreams, and our mind appears optimized to forget what transpired in those moments so that we might move through our waking hours unencumbered by the strange narratives of sleep. What makes this theory particularly compelling is how perfectly it explains the seemingly random nature of dream recall, for we do not forget all dreams equally, but rather we remember those that happen to occur just before our natural awakening, when the cycle has not yet completed its full rotation and reset. Yet we have nevertheless normalized this phenomenon to such an extent that we rarely question why this happens or consider it remarkable that our brains would evolve such an efficient system for erasing these experiences from our conscious awareness. There exists a curious distinction in how our bodies and minds treat sleep depending on the time of day it occurs, and this distinction profoundly influences what we remember and forget about our dreams. When we settle into bed at night for a full sleep cycle, we typically progress through multiple stages of sleep architecture, moving from light sleep through deeper non-rapid eye movement stages and then into rapid eye movement sleep, where most vivid dreaming occurs. These cycles repeat throughout the night in predictable patterns, and by morning we may retain fragments of dreams, particularly those occurring in the final REM period before waking. However, when we surrender to sleep during the day, whether for a brief 20-minute nap or a longer afternoon rest, our neurological response differs markedly. Daytime sleep often skips the traditional progression entirely, allowing us to enter REM sleep much faster than nighttime sleep would permit, a phenomenon known as sleep onset REM periods. This accelerated entry into dream sleep might suggest we would remember more dreams from naps, yet the opposite frequently occurs. The mechanism at work involves the dramatic difference in sleep consolidation and memory formation between sustained nighttime sleep and fragmented daytime rest. During night sleep, our brains engage in extensive memory processing and consolidation, strengthening neural pathways and integrating experiences into long-term memory through repeated cycles of sleep stages. Naps, by contrast, provide insufficient time for this comprehensive consolidation process, and the abrupt transition from wakefulness back to activity leaves dreams in a particularly fragile state, vulnerable to immediate displacement by waking consciousness. Additionally, our circadian rhythms strongly suppress deep sleep pressure during daylight hours, meaning nap sleep remains comparatively light and unstable even when we do experience rapid eye movement periods. Consider the bedroom at night, that space we have designated as our sanctuary for sleep, yet find ourselves inhabiting an increasingly complex acoustic environment where sounds from beyond our walls penetrate through windows, doors, and thin partitions with remarkable persistence. Traffic rumbles at irregular intervals, neighbors move about their lives in adjacent rooms, distant sirens wail through city streets, construction equipment operates on extended schedules, and the ambient hum of electricity and mechanical systems creates a baseline of sound that our ancestors never experienced in their sleeping spaces. When we lie down to sleep, our brains remain partially vigilant to these environmental stimuli, monitoring the acoustic landscape even as we attempt to transition into deeper sleep stages where dreams most vividly occur. The mechanism behind this phenomenon involves our reticular activating system, that ancient neural structure responsible for filtering sensory information and maintaining alertness to potential threats, which interprets unexpected or irregular noises as signals requiring conscious attention and assessment. When a sound disrupts our sleep architecture, it can cause brief arousal events that fragment the sleep cycles necessary for dream consolidation and memory formation, meaning that dreams occurring during or immediately following these micro-awakenings often fail to transfer into long-term memory or become too distorted to recall upon waking. What remains peculiar about this situation is that we have normalized living in profoundly noisy environments, despite the reality that sustained sound exposure degrades sleep quality in measurable ways. And we have developed an almost resigned acceptance of intermittent sleep disruption as simply part of modern existence rather than recognizing it as a legitimate interference with our neurological functioning. When two people share a bed, the quality of sleep often becomes a negotiated territory rather than a solitary experience, and this shared space creates a uniquely disruptive environment where the presence of another person becomes simultaneously comforting and destabilizing to the architecture of our dreams. The physical proximity of a bed partner introduces a constant stream of micro-interruptions that our brains register even during deeper stages of sleep, whether through subtle movements, changes in mattress tension, variations in body heat, or the simple awareness that another consciousness exists inches away from our own. These interruptions fragment our sleep cycles in ways that make dream recall exceptionally difficult, as the continuous cycling between light sleep and deeper sleep stages becomes increasingly irregular, preventing the extended periods of REM sleep necessary for vivid dream formation and subsequent memory consolidation. Our brains, evolutionarily primed to remain partially alert when sleeping near another person due to ancient survival instincts, maintain a baseline level of vigilance that operates counter to the deep relaxation required for robust dreaming. And this neurological tension means that even when we do dream, the memories are scattered and incomplete before our conscious minds ever have a chance to grasp them. The psychological mechanism compounds this physical reality through what sleep researchers identify as a form of sleep accommodation, wherein our minds unconsciously prioritize the social bonds and safety signals of proximity over the luxury of uninterrupted dream cycles, essentially training our memory systems to suppress or rapidly discard dream content in favor of maintaining relational awareness. Consider the experience of waking from a dream in which you felt profound terror, overwhelming sadness, or inexplicable rage, only to find yourself in the safety and calm of your bedroom, where nothing catastrophic has occurred and no genuine threat exists around you. Your body may still be trembling, your heart rate elevated, your chest tight with the residual emotional weight of events that never actually happened, yet the feeling persists stubbornly even as your rational mind confirms the dream's unreality. This phenomenon, wherein the emotional intensity of a dream remains entirely disconnected from the actual circumstances of your waking life, represents a fascinating breakdown in the brain's ability to properly calibrate emotional response to context. The limbic system, which generates these powerful feelings during sleep, operates largely independently of the prefrontal cortex, which would normally evaluate whether an emotion is proportionate to the actual situation at hand. During sleep, this regulatory mechanism falls silent, allowing dreams to generate emotions of spectacular magnitude in response to imaginary stimuli that would scarcely warrant such intensity in reality. Upon waking, even though you intellectually understand that the dream was not real, the emotional imprint remains burned into your neurochemistry, leaving you feeling unsettled, anxious, or melancholic for hours afterward. What makes this particularly puzzling is that we have largely accepted this emotional hangover as an inevitable part of the human experience, rarely questioning why our brains should betray us so thoroughly by maintaining emotional states that serve no protective or practical purpose in our actual lives. We simply acknowledge that dreams affect us, that they linger, and we move forward with the weight of phantom emotions, almost as though our minds are designed to be inefficient in their processing and release of nocturnal experiences. Consider the experience of waking from a dream in the middle of the night, gripped by the sensation that you are holding something precious and fragile, a story that was unfolding with such clarity and momentum that you feel certain you will remember every detail once morning arrives. Yet by the time you have fully opened your eyes and adjusted to consciousness, the narrative has already begun to dissolve, leaving you grasping for the thread of what you were just witnessing. This phenomenon, which we might call unfinished narrative loss, describes the particular vulnerability of dreams that lack resolution or conclusion, those dreams where the plot was still developing, where tension had not yet peaked and fallen away, where the story remained fundamentally incomplete. Our brains appear to struggle with preserving narratives that have no clear ending, no point of narrative closure where we might naturally consolidate and file away the experience. When a dream concludes with a definitive moment, a sudden awakening within the dream, a resolution to conflict, a clear emotional punctuation, the brain seems to handle the memory differently than when a dream simply trails off into vagueness or continues in circular patterns without direction. The psychological explanation centers on how human memory has evolved to prioritize completed information and resolved experiences. For throughout our evolutionary history, completed narratives have provided closure that allows the mind to move forward, to integrate the experience into our broader understanding of events and ourselves. Unfinished stories trigger different neural activity, keeping certain cognitive systems active in a state of suspension, holding the narrative open as if waiting for more information to arrive, and this open-loop state makes the memory particularly susceptible to degradation and interference. As we drift toward sleep each night, our brain engages in a sophisticated process of information triage, systematically sorting through the accumulated experiences, thoughts, and sensations of the day to determine what deserves to be encoded into long-term memory and what can safely be discarded. And this natural cognitive filtering mechanism represents one of the most elegant solutions our nervous system has developed to manage the overwhelming volume of data it processes every single moment. During the dream phase of sleep, particularly during rapid eye movement sleep when most vivid dreams occur, our brain generates elaborate narratives and visual sequences that seem intensely real and emotionally significant in the moment. Yet upon waking, the vast majority of these dreams evaporate from consciousness almost immediately, leaving behind only fragmented impressions or nothing at all. The mechanism behind this selective forgetting operates through the interaction of neurochemical systems that actively suppress the formation of new memories during sleep, particularly the reduced levels of norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter critical for encoding experiences into hippocampal memory structures, which means that dreams are quite literally being generated in a neurochemical state that prevents their consolidation into retrievable memories. Our brain distinguishes between experiences that carry evolutionary significance and those that are essentially noise, determining that the surreal, often meaningless narratives constructed during REM sleep need not clutter our autobiographical memory store with false or irrelevant information, and therefore allows them to fade away naturally rather than expending metabolic resources to preserve them.